I am Dominic, 69 years old, and I learned the hard way that the most vicious predators do not hide in dark alleys. They sit at your dinner table and call you family. 2 months ago, my daughter-in-law struck me across the face in my own home while my own son watched and did nothing. I stayed absolutely quiet. I did not scream. I did not fight back. But 2 months later, I set the dining room table for a very special gathering, and when she saw exactly who was sitting there waiting for her, the color completely drained from her arrogant face. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that respect is earned and betrayal should always be punished. The slap came with such sudden vicious force that it echoed through the vast expanse of my custom-built kitchen. The impact snapped my head to the side. My prescription glasses flew off my face, hitting the imported Italian tile floor with a sharp crack, the lenses shattering into a dozen jagged pieces. The sting on my left cheek was a spreading, burning fire, but it was nothing compared to the icy shock paralyzing my chest. Megan, my daughter-in-law of 4 years, stood over me. Her chest was heaving, her perfectly manicured hand still raised in the air, trembling slightly from the sheer force of the blow she had just delivered to a man nearly 40 years her senior. I slowly turned my head, my blurred vision searching for the one person who should have instantly tackled her to the ground. Tyson, my only son. He was standing by the stainless steel refrigerator, nervously picking at the label of a water bottle. When my eyes found his, he cowered. He turned his face away, staring blankly out the kitchen window into the dark Chicago night, pretending he had not just watched his wife physically assault his elderly father. Megan stepped closer, her designer heels clicking sharply against the broken glass of my spectacles. She did not look sorry. She looked utterly triumphant. She reached into her expensive leather tote bag, a bag I had paid for last Christmas, and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. She slammed them down onto the center island marble counter with a resounding thud. "You think you hold all the cards, old man," Megan hissed, her voice dripping with absolute venom. "You think just because you built this little empire you get to dictate how we live our lives." I squinted at the documents. Even without my glasses, the bold black letters at the top of the page were unmistakable. General power of attorney. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. Attached to the front was a notarized signature page. My signature. Or rather, a flawless forgery of it. 3 days ago, I had firmly refused to co-sign a $2 million business loan for Megan. She had pitched me some vague, high-yield investment firm she wanted to start with her friends. I had spent 40 years in commercial real estate. I know a scam when I see one. I told her no, and I told Tyson he needed to stop letting his wife drain his trust fund on pipe dreams. I thought that was the end of it. I was a fool. "This gives me full, unrestricted executive control over your entire estate, Dominic," she said, tapping a perfectly painted fingernail against the forged paper. "Your bank accounts, your investment portfolios, and the deeds to every single commercial property you own in this city. It is all under my management now. The courts recognize me as your legal financial guardian." I stared at her, the reality of her treachery sinking in. She had somehow found a crooked notary to stamp a forged signature. She was stealing $2 million of liquid assets and property right out from under me simply because I refused to hand it over willingly. She had orchestrated a complete financial coup, stealing the life savings I had bled for, all while sleeping under my roof and eating the food I provided. Tyson still did not turn around. The silence from his corner of the kitchen was the loudest noise I had ever heard in my entire life. A normal man might have screamed. A normal man might have lunged at her throat demanding answers or collapsed in tears at the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. But I am not a normal man. I grew up with nothing on the South Side. I built a commercial real estate business with my bare hands laying bricks and pouring concrete until my joints ached, fighting for every single inch of respect in a world that did not want to see a black man succeed. I learned a long time ago that panic is a luxury poor men cannot afford. Anger is just a loud way to announce your next move to the enemy. So, I remained completely silent. I did not give Megan the satisfaction of seeing me break. I slowly wiped a small drop of blood from the corner of my mouth, my face a mask of absolute stone. I calmly reached my hand out toward the kitchen island, stretching my fingers toward my smartphone resting near the fruit bowl. I needed to call Jonathan Hayes, my attorney. I needed to freeze my accounts before she could transfer a single dime. Megan anticipated the move. With a sudden, animalistic shriek, she lunged forward. She grabbed my phone with both hands and lifted it high above her head. Before I could even stand up properly, she brought it down with devastating force against the sharp square edge of the marble countertop. The screen shattered instantly, the metal frame bending backward with a sickening crunch. She threw the ruined device onto the floor next to my broken glasses, effectively cutting off my only immediate lifeline to the outside world. "You are not calling anyone," she snarled, stepping directly into my personal space. Her breath smelled heavily of the expensive red wine I kept in my private cellar. "Do you really not understand what is happening right now, Dominic? You do not make the rules anymore. You do not get to say no to me ever again. You are just a fragile, confused old man whose mind is starting to slip, and I am the one tasked with the heavy burden of taking care of your affairs." She pointed a shaking finger toward the kitchen door leading to the main hallway. "This is my house now. I control the mortgage, I control the property taxes, and I control who gets to live here. I am so entirely sick of looking at you and listening to your constant arrogant lectures about hard work and sacrifice. You are no longer the master of this estate. I am." I stood my ground, keeping my posture perfectly straight despite the absolute chaos swirling around me. I looked deep into her eyes, seeing nothing but pure, unadulterated greed and a desperate hunger for power she had never worked a single day to earn. "I want you out of my sight immediately," she commanded, her voice dropping to a cold, menacing whisper. "You are going to go upstairs, pack a single bag of your clothes, and wait for my instructions. You are moving into the unfinished basement tonight. If you cause a scene, if you try to leave this property, or if you attempt to contact anyone, I will call the police. I will tell them you attacked me in a fit of dementia, and they will lock you away in a state facility before sunrise. Go pack your things right now, old man." Less than an hour later, two massive men in cheap black suits stood in my custom kitchen. Megan had not even waited for me to pack my own bags. She had called a private security firm, undoubtedly paying them using my own credit cards. They marched upstairs to my master bedroom and began tossing my belongings into heavy-duty trash bags. I watched in total silence as decades of my life were unceremoniously dumped into black plastic. My custom-tailored suits, my late wife's framed photographs, the leather-bound books I had read every evening for 20 years were all swept away like garbage. The guards hauled the heavy bags down the narrow wooden stairs leading to the unfinished basement, tossing them carelessly onto the cold concrete floor. The basement was a space I had intentionally left raw. It was meant to be a storage area for construction materials, not a living quarters for a human being. The air down there was terribly damp and smelled of old dust and exposed fiberglass insulation. A single naked light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting long, harsh shadows across the gray concrete blocks. The guards pointed to a rusted metal cot pushed against the far wall. Megan had explicitly told them to make sure I stayed down here. Before leaving, the larger guard grabbed the heavy wooden door at the top of the stairs and slammed it shut. The distinct metallic click of a deadbolt sliding into place echoed through the darkness. I was locked in. My own house had officially become my prison. I did not bang on the solid door. I did not shout for my son to come save me. I simply walked down the wooden steps, my joints aching from the damp chill, and stood in the middle of the dim room. I began untying the thick plastic knots of the trash bags, methodically pulling out my crumpled clothes and laying them flat across the bare mattress. I needed to establish some kind of order in this sudden chaos. While reaching deep into the bottom of the third bag, my hand brushed against something heavy and incredibly familiar. I felt the texture of thick, worn leather and cold, solid steel. It was my old construction tool belt, the exact same belt I had worn when I poured the very foundation of this house 30 years ago. Holding it in my hands brought a sudden, powerful surge of clarity to my mind. Megan thought she was locking a helpless, confused old man in a dungeon. She completely forgot she was locking a master builder inside his own blueprint. I strapped the heavy leather belt around my waist, letting the familiar weight ground my racing thoughts. I walked purposefully over to the north wall of the basement. I ran my calloused fingers along the drywall I had installed myself decades ago. I counted the wooden studs by lightly tapping the heavy handle of a screwdriver against the plaster. 1, 2, 3, 4, right there. I jammed the flathead screwdriver into a nearly invisible seam near the floorboard and pried it open with a sharp twist. A small rectangular section of the drywall popped out, revealing a hidden cavity nestled deep between the thick insulation. Inside rested a small dust-covered metal lockbox. I had put it there 15 years ago during a particularly vicious legal battle with a rival contractor who tried to freeze my company assets. I opened the box. Inside was a prepaid burner phone fully charged and turned off along with a thick stack of $100 bills. I took the phone out and powered it on. The bright blue screen illuminated the dark corner of the basement. I finally had a secure line to the outside world completely invisible to Megan and her hired thugs. I immediately dialed the private VIP number for my senior wealth manager at the downtown branch of First National Bank. It was very late, but premium clients had 24-hour access to emergency services. The phone rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered the call. I calmly identified myself and gave him my secure verification PIN. I instructed him to immediately transfer all $4 million from my primary retirement accounts into an offshore holding account I maintained for extreme emergencies. There was a long, incredibly painful silence on the other end of the line. The manager cleared his throat, his voice trembling slightly as he spoke. He told me he could not execute the transfer under any circumstances. I demanded to know exactly why my own money was restricted. He explained that less than 2 hours ago, a woman claiming to be my legal guardian had faxed over a court-approved power of attorney, accompanied by a sworn medical affidavit declaring me mentally incompetent. The legal department of the bank had flagged and locked my accounts instantly. Every single dollar, every mutual fund, every line of credit tied to my Social Security number was entirely frozen. The manager apologized profusely, but stated that strict federal banking regulations tied his hands until a judge formally reviewed the case in a court of law. Megan had not just stolen my house. She had systematically cut off my entire financial oxygen supply. She had executed a flawless corporate strike, moving with a speed and ruthless precision I frankly did not think she possessed. Without that money, I could not hire a high-powered litigation team. I could not fight her in probate court. I hung up the burner phone and stared blankly at the concrete floor. The gravity of the situation finally settled heavily on my shoulders. I was a millionaire on paper, but in reality I was a hostage sleeping on a rusted cot, completely stripped of the resources I had spent a lifetime accumulating. I sat down heavily on the edge of the thin mattress, calculating my next move. I needed cash untraceable and immediate. I glanced back at the open wall cavity, knowing the hidden stack of bills inside was my only ammunition left. Suddenly, the heavy deadbolt at the top of the stairs clicked loudly. The heavy wooden door groaned open. I quickly shoved the burner phone deep into my pocket and kicked the piece of drywall back into place, hiding the lockbox just in time. Heavy, hesitant footsteps began descending the wooden staircase. The steps were too slow to be the hired security guards and far too heavy to be Megan. A tall figure stepped into the dim light of the single bulb. It was Tyson. My son stood awkwardly at the bottom of the stairs, refusing to make eye contact with me. He looked at the damp concrete walls, the trash bags scattered on the floor, and the rusted cot. He swallowed hard but offered absolutely no apologies. He did not ask if I was hurt or if I needed a warm blanket. Instead, he reached his hand out, palm facing up. He told me Megan had a very important meeting across town tomorrow morning and her luxury SUV was currently in the repair shop. He demanded the keys to my fully restored vintage Mustang parked in the garage. The car was my absolute pride and joy, the only material possession I loved more than this house. He stood there, a grown man acting as an errand boy for the woman who had just ruined his father, demanding I hand over the keys to my most prized possession. I looked at the man standing on the cold concrete floor and struggled to find any trace of the little boy I had raised. Tyson was 35 years old, yet he stood there with his shoulders slumped, completely subjugated by a woman who viewed us both as nothing more than walking bank accounts. He wanted the keys to the 1968 Mustang I had meticulously restored with my own hands. It was the exact car I drove his mother to the hospital in when he was born. I did not argue. I did not plead with him to recognize the absolute insanity of his request. I walked over to the small pile of belongings the security guards had thrown down the stairs earlier. I sifted through the pockets of my ruined wool trousers until my fingers closed around the familiar cold metal of the Mustang keys. I walked back to the bottom of the stairs and held them out. Tyson reached down and took them. Our fingers brushed for a fraction of a second, and he flinched as if he had been burned. He mumbled a pathetic, barely audible thank you before turning his back on me to retreat up the stairs. He was not just stealing a vehicle. He was actively participating in the execution of his own father to appease his wife. Any lingering hope I had that Tyson might secretly be on my side, that he might be acting under duress or waiting for a quiet moment to help me, evaporated completely in that damp basement air. He had made his choice. As the heavy deadbolt slid into place once again, I felt a strange sense of emotional liberation wash over me. The heavy chains of paternal obligation were gone. Tyson was no longer my blind spot. He was simply collateral damage in the war his wife had just started. Now that my massive financial accounts were officially frozen and my own flesh and blood had abandoned me, I needed immediate liquidity. The burner phone was an excellent tool, but it was absolutely useless without the capital required to fund a serious counterattack. I walked past the rusted metal cot toward the far end of the basement where an old, non-functioning brick fireplace sat built securely into the foundation. I had constructed it myself during the initial framing of the house, ostensibly to add rustic character to the lower level. In reality, it served a much more practical purpose. I knelt on the freezing concrete and counted the dark red bricks along the bottom hearth, moving exactly 4 rows up and 2 bricks across from the left edge. I pressed my thumbs firmly against the rough mortar lines. The heavy brick shifted backward with a faint scraping sound. I gripped the exposed edges and pulled the hollowed-out brick completely free from the wall. I reached deep into the dark cavity and pulled out a heavy vacuum-sealed plastic bag. Inside the thick plastic were 5 neat stacks of $100 bills totaling exactly $50,000. It was untraceable cash I had systematically withdrawn in small increments over the past decade, a quiet insurance policy against the unpredictable and often ruthless nature of the commercial real estate market. I broke the tight vacuum seal with my thumbs and stuffed 3 of the heavy stacks into the deep pockets of my winter coat. Money is the only language people like Megan truly understand, and I was about to speak it very fluently. I checked the glowing dial of my wristwatch. It was precisely 2 in the morning. The massive house above me was completely silent. Megan and Tyson were undoubtedly asleep in the master suite, secure in their delusion that they had successfully neutralized me. I moved quietly to the small egress window near the ceiling of the eastern wall. It was designed for emergency fire escapes, something I had firmly insisted on installing over the original architect's objections. I flipped the metal latch, pushed the heavy glass pane outward into the window well, and hoisted my body up. The freezing Chicago night air hit my face as I squeezed through the narrow opening and crawled onto the frozen grass of my own backyard. I stayed low to the ground, using the deep shadows of the tall oak trees to navigate toward the back iron gate. Once I was 2 blocks away from the estate, I pulled the burner phone from my coat pocket and hailed a private car service, paying the driver generously in cash to ensure total silence and absolute discretion. 20 minutes later, I was sitting in the dimly lit downtown office of Jonathan Hayes, my personal attorney and oldest friend. Jonathan had rushed out of bed and driven straight to his office the moment I called him. I slid a clear digital photograph of the forged power of attorney document across his polished mahogany desk. I had managed to take the picture with my burner phone while Megan was distracted, screaming at me in the kitchen earlier that evening. Jonathan adjusted his reading glasses and scrutinized the digital image, his jaw tightening with visible anger. He zoomed in on the official notary seal stamped near the bottom right corner of the signature page. He cursed under his breath. The stamp belonged to a man named Gavin Brooks. Jonathan recognized the name instantly from a series of highly questionable real estate transactions involving shady shell companies 2 years ago. Gavin was a disgraced former paralegal known in underground corporate circles for authenticating fraudulent legal documents for the right price. Megan had not just found a random public notary to execute her plan. She had actively sought out a known criminal. Jonathan and I spent the next 2 hours formulating a precise, aggressive legal strategy to dismantle her entire operation. I left his towering office building just as the first faint streaks of purple dawn began to break over the freezing city skyline. The exact same private driver dropped me off a few blocks from my quiet residential neighborhood. I retraced my steps through the biting morning cold, slipping quietly through the back iron gate and lowering my body back down into the deep basement window well. I pulled the heavy glass pane shut carefully, securing the metal latch so it looked completely undisturbed from the inside. I brushed the dead leaves and damp dirt off my winter coat, taking a slow, deep breath to steady my racing heart. I had a solid plan and a coat pocket full of untraceable cash. For the first time in 24 hours, I felt a genuine sense of power and control over my own destiny. I turned around to walk back to the rusted cot to wait for the morning. The single naked light bulb dangling from the basement ceiling suddenly flicked on, blinding me for a split second. Sitting rigidly on the edge of my bare mattress was Megan. She was fully dressed in a sharp designer suit, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Resting squarely on her lap was the heavy leather construction tool belt I had meticulously hidden behind the drywall just hours earlier. Her eyes were dark manic and filled with violent suspicion. She stood up slowly, letting the heavy belt slide off her lap and crash loudly onto the concrete floor. She took a deliberate step toward me, her voice cutting through the damp basement air like a sharpened razor blade. She demanded to know exactly how I got fresh dirt on my shoes and exactly where I had been all night. I stared down at the heavy clumps of damp earth clinging to the soles of my Italian leather loafers. I did not flinch under her manic gaze, nor did I betray the slightest hint of the $50,000 sitting heavily in my coat pocket. I looked her dead in the eye and told her the damp smell down in this dungeon was not just mold, it was vermin. I explained that I had heard loud frantic scratching against the eastern foundation wall, large rats trying to nest in the exposed fiberglass insulation. I told her I grabbed my old tool belt and climbed out the emergency egress window to check the exterior drainage grates. I made sure to emphasize that if the rats chewed through the main electrical lines hidden behind the drywall, her newly stolen mansion would burn to the ground before the fire department even left their station. She stared at me, her eyes narrowing as she calculated the logic of my lie. The sheer mundane reality of pest control seemed entirely beneath her grand, white-collar criminal schemes. She tossed the heavy leather belt onto the rusted cot in absolute disgust. She warned me to stop playing handyman, ordering me to stay in the basement and out of her sight. She smoothed the lapels of her sharp charcoal gray designer suit and checked the face of her diamond-studded watch. She boasted loudly that she had a multi-million-dollar meeting downtown this morning, a crucial negotiation that would permanently solidify her absolute control over my entire financial legacy. She pulled the silver keys to my 1968 Mustang from her blazer pocket and dangled them right in front of my face. It was a final petty act of dominance before she turned on her expensive heels and strutted up the wooden stairs. The heavy deadbolt clicked shut again. I let out a slow, steady breath. She had bought the lie completely. But more importantly, she was taking the Mustang. What Megan did not know, and what Tyson was simply too foolish to ever check, was that handing over a set of keys did not necessarily mean handing over a functioning vehicle. When I had reached into my pockets earlier to give my son the keys, I was not just resigning myself to a bitter defeat. Prior to being dragged down to the basement by her rented security guards, I had spent a few quiet, calculating moments alone in the garage. I knew every single wire, every steel bolt, and every electrical fuse of that engine because I had completely rebuilt it myself over the course of 3 years. It took me exactly 10 seconds to pop the hood and slip the primary ignition relay out of the main fuse box, sliding the small black plastic cube into my trouser pocket. The vintage Mustang would start perfectly fine in the driveway. It would run beautifully for about 20 minutes, just long enough to get her merging onto the Kennedy Expressway during the absolute peak of morning rush hour. Then, the engine heat would cause the compromised circuit to fail entirely. The car would not sputter or cough as a warning. It would simply shut down instantly, locking the heavy power steering wheel and killing the entire electrical system. It would strand her dead in the middle of 6 lanes of hostile, fast-moving Chicago traffic. I sat on my rusted metal cot in the dim, damp basement, picturing her frantic, humiliating panic as the custom dashboard went completely black. I pictured her screaming at the tow truck dispatcher over the phone, ruining her expensive heels on the oily highway asphalt, and most importantly, completely missing the crucial meeting she had just gloated about. I was stripping away her power one piece at a time. 3 hours later, the heavy basement door violently flew open. The metal deadbolt actually shattered against the wooden frame from the sheer brute force of her kick. Megan stormed down the steep wooden stairs, no longer the composed, arrogant corporate thief from this morning. Her expensive designer suit was stained with black road grit. Her hair was completely disheveled from the highway wind, and her face was a terrifying mask of pure, unhinged rage. She did not say a single word as she crossed the concrete floor toward me. She just pulled her arm back and swung. The slap landed on the exact same cheek she had struck the night before, splitting my lower lip violently against my teeth. The sharp, metallic taste of fresh blood instantly filled my mouth. I stumbled back against the cold brick of the fireplace, but quickly caught my balance. I reached deep into the pocket of my winter coat, my fingers wrapping securely around the burner phone I had retrieved from the wall. I did not pull the device out. Instead, I pressed my thumb hard against the side volume button, executing the quick command to activate the voice recorder application I had queued up precisely for this highly anticipated moment. She screamed at the top of her lungs that I had done something to the car. She accused me of deliberately sabotaging the engine and actively trying to ruin her life. I kept my posture relaxed and my voice incredibly calm, perfectly playing the part of the confused, helpless elderly victim. I told her I had absolutely no idea what she was talking about. I reminded her she was the one who demanded the keys and locked me down in this basement. My calm, logical denial only fueled her psychotic anger further. She wanted a massive reaction. She wanted me to beg for mercy or fight back physically so she could justify calling the police to report an assault. I gave her nothing but a cold, empty silence, forcing her to fill the void with her own deeply incriminating rage. Pacing frantically back and forth across the damp concrete floor, Megan finally lost whatever remaining shred of self-control she had left. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest, completely unaware that the highly sensitive microphone hidden in my coat pocket was capturing every single venomous syllable she spoke. She told me my petty little sabotage games would not save me from what was coming. She screamed that my precious real estate empire was already gone, effectively erased from my name. She leaned in close, the foul smell of highway exhaust fumes and stale coffee radiating from her ruined clothes. She proudly declared that she was selling my entire portfolio of commercial downtown buildings to a massive private equity firm called Apex Holdings. She explicitly stated that the ink on the final contracts would be dry in exactly 3 weeks. $20 million would be wired directly into her private offshore accounts, completely out of my reach forever. And the moment that massive wire transfer cleared, she promised she was going to have me permanently committed to a state-run psychiatric ward where I would rot for the rest of my miserable life. She spun around and marched back up the stairs, slamming the broken door shut and dragging a heavy piece of oak furniture across the floorboards above to keep me physically trapped. I pulled the burner phone from my pocket and pressed the screen to stop the recording. I played it back immediately. The digital audio file was crystal clear, capturing her confession of theft and premeditated fraud perfectly. I wiped the drying blood from my chin and smiled in the dark. Apex Holdings. 3 weeks. The game board was finally set, and my arrogant daughter-in-law had just handed me the exact coordinates of her own spectacular destruction. The heavy scraping of oak furniture across the floorboards above me signaled the beginning of a new day. It was early the next morning when the shattered deadbolt was forcefully pulled open again. Megan descended the wooden stairs with a slow, deliberate pace. She had completely abandoned the manic, screaming rage from yesterday. Instead, she wore a chilling, calculated calmness that was infinitely more dangerous. She was dressed in comfortable cashmere loungewear, holding a steaming mug of artisanal coffee in one hand and a glossy piece of folded paper in the other. She did not yell. She walked straight over to my rusted metal cot and casually tossed the pamphlet onto my thin blanket. I looked down at the cheap, poorly printed brochure. The cover featured a stock photo of a smiling elderly woman, but the bold text underneath revealed a much darker reality. It was a prospectus for Oak Ridge Care Center, a notoriously underfunded, state-run nursing home located on the industrial outskirts of the city. It was a facility infamous for severe neglect, overcrowding, and heavily medicated patients staring blankly at peeling walls. Megan took a sip of her coffee and smiled down at me. She softly explained that since I was clearly exhibiting signs of severe paranoia and destructive behavior, she had a moral obligation to ensure I received 24-hour professional supervision. She told me the paperwork was already being finalized by a state-appointed physician she had generously compensated. The moment the Apex Holdings wire transfer cleared her offshore accounts in exactly 3 weeks, a medical transport van would arrive at the front gate to take me away permanently. She promised me I would spend the rest of my days in a heavily sedated haze, surrounded by the smell of ammonia and forgotten people. I stared at the glossy brochure resting on my lap, but I did not see the stock photos of the grim facility. Instead, my mind instantly transported me back to a sterile, brightly lit hospital room 15 years ago. I remembered the overwhelming smell of clinical antiseptic and the steady, haunting beep of a heart monitor. I felt the fragile, paper-thin hands of my late wife Evelyn holding tightly onto my rough, calloused fingers. We had spent our entire lives building our real estate empire side by side. While I was pouring concrete and negotiating brutal union contracts, Evelyn was managing the ledgers, stretching every single dollar and sacrificing the simple luxuries of her youth so we could secure a dynasty for our family. On her deathbed, her breathing labored and her eyes tired. She made me swear a solemn oath. She made me promise that I would never let anyone dismantle the legacy we had bled to build. She made me vow to protect our life's work from the vultures who always circle the successful. Sitting in this damp, freezing basement staring at the ultimate disrespect Megan had just thrown at my feet, I felt a profound shift deep within my chest. Gathering the audio confession on my burner phone was a solid defensive maneuver, but it was fundamentally inadequate. Simply proving her fraud in a drawn-out multi-year legal battle would not honor Evelyn's memory. A defensive war would allow Megan to tie up my assets, drain my accounts through legal fees, and drag our family name through the public mud. I realized with absolute clarity that I could not just survive this betrayal. I had to completely annihilate her scheme before it even materialized. Defensive moves were no longer enough. It was time to go on a ruthless, unsparing offensive. To stop the catastrophic sale to Apex Holdings, I had to understand the precise mechanics of a massive commercial real estate transaction. Megan possessed a forged power of attorney, which gave her the legal authority to sign contracts on my behalf. However, corporate acquisitions involving $20 million in prime downtown real estate are never executed on blind faith. Private equity firms like Apex are notoriously cautious. Before any funds are wired into an escrow account, their high-priced corporate lawyers require absolute undeniable verification of ownership. They demand the physical handover of the original county-stamped property deeds. Without those original heavy parchment documents bearing the municipal watermarks, the entire $20 million transaction would instantly grind to a permanent halt. I knew exactly where those deeds were. They were not at the bank, nor were they filed away in my downtown office. I had always kept the original documents inside the master suite of this very house, secured in a massive floor-mounted titanium safe, hidden behind a false panel in the walk-in closet. When Megan seized control of my life, the very first thing she did was reprogram that specific safe. She had completely wiped my access codes and installed a state-of-the-art biometric fingerprint scanner, locking the deeds away under her own physical identity. She felt entirely secure, knowing that even if I somehow escaped the basement, I could never bypass a military-grade biometric lock without her right index finger. But Megan was a corporate parasite who only understood the surface of things. She relied on expensive technology she bought with stolen money, fundamentally ignorant of how the physical world actually operates. She thought she had fortified the castle, completely forgetting who laid the stones. I pushed the nursing home brochure off my cot and let it fall onto the damp concrete floor. I closed my eyes and tuned out the dripping sound of a leaky pipe in the corner of the basement. I began to visualize the intricate hidden anatomy of the massive mansion surrounding me. I pictured the heavy copper wiring snaking behind the imported drywall. I traced the main electrical conduits running from the primary breaker box in the garage up through the first-floor ceiling joists and directly into the master suite overhead. I remembered the exact voltage capacity of every single line because my own hands had run those wires 30 years ago. Biometric safes are incredibly secure against brute force attacks, drills, and standard lockpicks. However, they rely entirely on a continuous stable flow of electricity to power the capacitive fingerprint sensors. Every electronic lock built for residential use possesses a mandatory, mechanically triggered failsafe designed for catastrophic power surges. If the main circuit board experiences a highly specific, perfectly timed voltage overload, the system forces an emergency reset, exposing a brief 5-second window where the secondary mechanical override engages. It was an incredibly dangerous maneuver that carried a high risk of starting an electrical fire inside the walls, but I no longer had the luxury of playing it safe. I opened my eyes, staring intensely at the bare ceiling above me. I did not just need to break out of this basement. I needed to execute a flawless, high-stakes heist inside my own home, right under the noses of the people who thought they had buried me. As soon as the heavy oak furniture scraped across the floorboards above me, signaling that Megan and Tyson had gone to sleep, I put the first phase of my offensive strategy into motion. I could not execute the heist for the physical property deeds until I completely destroyed the legal foundation of her forged power of attorney. I reached into my winter coat, feeling the thick, reassuring stacks of $100 bills I had pulled from the fireplace hearth. I powered on the burner phone and dialed a highly secure number Jonathan Hayes had given me during our midnight meeting. It belonged to an independent private investigator named Marcus, a retired Chicago police detective who specialized in tracking down corporate ghosts and financial criminals. I did not negotiate his exorbitant daily rate. I simply gave him the name Gavin Brooks, the corrupt notary who had stamped away my life savings, and I promised a $10,000 cash bonus for immediate actionable results. Marcus operated with the kind of ruthless, silent efficiency that only untraceable cash can buy. Less than 24 hours later, my burner phone buzzed with an encrypted text message containing an address and a single surveillance photograph. Gavin Brooks was not hiding in a luxury penthouse or fleeing the country. Like most low-level parasites who forge legal documents for quick payouts, his habits were entirely predictable. The address belonged to a dimly lit, windowless dive bar located deep in the decaying industrial sector of the South Side. I waited until midnight, slipped through the basement egress window into the freezing night air, and hailed a private car service to take me to the location. I walked into the bar, the overwhelming smell of stale beer and cheap tobacco hitting me instantly. The flickering neon signs cast a sickly green light over the scattered patrons. I immediately spotted him sitting alone in a dark corner booth. Gavin Brooks looked exactly like the kind of man who would sell another man's entire life for a handful of cash. He was thin, sweating profusely despite the cold draft in the room, and nervously nursing a glass of cheap whiskey. I did not bring a weapon, and I did not ask Marcus, the private investigator, to accompany me to intimidate him. True power does not need to shout, threaten physical violence, or flex its muscles. I simply walked over to the dark corner booth and slid into the cracked leather seat directly across from him. Gavin jumped, spilling his whiskey. His bloodshot eyes darted frantically toward the exit. Before he could even formulate a coherent thought of running away, I reached inside my heavy coat and pulled out a thick manila folder Jonathan had meticulously prepared for me that morning. I dropped it onto the sticky wooden table with a heavy, resounding thud. The sudden noise made Gavin flinch violently. I calmly introduced myself as Dominic, the man whose entire real estate empire and life savings he had illegally signed away just a few days ago. Gavin swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he desperately tried to stammer out a denial. He claimed he had absolutely no idea what I was talking about, insisting that he processed hundreds of routine legal documents a week. I raised a single hand, silencing his pathetic lies instantly. I told him he should look inside the folder before he dug his grave any deeper into the concrete. With shaking fingers, Gavin opened the manila envelope. Inside were not just high-resolution copies of the forged power of attorney. Jonathan had pulled every single public and private financial record tied to Gavin over the last decade. The dossier contained undeniable, legally binding proof of massive federal tax evasion, fraudulent shell company registrations, and multiple counts of interstate wire fraud. I leaned across the table, maintaining absolute, unwavering eye contact. I explained to Gavin that my attorney had a direct line to the criminal division of the Internal Revenue Service. I gave him a very simple choice. He could walk out of this bar and face a federal indictment by tomorrow morning, guaranteeing he would spend the next 20 years in a maximum security prison. Or he could tell me exactly how my daughter-in-law orchestrated the forgery, and I would keep the federal agents entirely out of his miserable life. The color completely drained from Gavin's face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. The sheer weight of the federal charges staring back at him broke his resolve in an instant. He collapsed back against the vinyl booth, burying his face in his trembling hands. He started crying, letting out the pathetic, gasping sobs of a cornered rat who finally realized the trap had snapped shut on his neck. He frantically reached into the pocket of his worn jacket and pulled out his unlocked smartphone. He slid the device across the sticky table toward me without hesitation. He told me everything. He confessed that Megan had approached him a week ago through a mutual contact in the underground real estate market. She was desperate, aggressive, and completely ruthless. I scrolled through the text messages on his bright screen. There it was in plain text. Megan had offered him $10,000 in untraceable cryptocurrency to stamp the power of attorney and sign the medical affidavit without asking any questions. The messages outlined the exact time and place the forgery was to be executed. She had even provided Gavin with several digital samples of my signature to practice tracing over a lightbox. Gavin sobbed that he desperately needed the money to pay off his own crippling gambling debts to dangerous men. He begged me to believe that he did not know she was going to use the documents to steal a $20 million portfolio and physically lock me inside a basement. I pulled my burner phone out and meticulously photographed every single text message, every digital timestamp, and every cryptocurrency transfer receipt displayed on his screen. I now possess the exact irrefutable evidence required to put Megan in a federal penitentiary. I gathered the thick manila folder and stood up from the booth, preparing to leave him in his pathetic misery. But as I turned to walk away, Gavin wiped his nose and spoke up, his voice barely a whisper over the muffled jukebox music playing in the background. He told me there was one more thing I desperately needed to know, something that was not recorded in any of the text messages. He looked up at me, his bloodshot eyes filled with a twisted, sickening kind of pity. He explained that when Megan came to his cheap motel room to finalize the forged signatures on the legal documents, she did not come alone. Gavin vividly described the man who stood silently by the door the entire time. He described his exact height, the specific designer watch he wore, and the cowardly way he nervously avoided making eye contact with anyone in the room. It was Tyson. My son had not just turned a blind eye to my abuse after the fact. He had actively stood in the very room where his wife forged the documents that stripped me of my life savings and my fundamental freedom. Tyson had watched her practice tracing my name and did absolutely nothing to stop it. The revelation struck me like a physical blow to the chest, colder and much sharper than the slap Megan had delivered to my face. I walked out of the dive bar and stepped into the freezing Chicago wind. Any lingering trace of paternal mercy I had left completely evaporated into the night air. Tyson was no longer my child. He was a willing accomplice to my destruction. And when the time came to burn Megan's world to the ground, I would not shed a single tear when the flames consumed him too. It was Friday night, exactly 2 days after my brutal encounter with Gavin Brooks at the dive bar. The heavy wooden floorboards above my head were vibrating with the rhythmic thump of a high-end sound system. Megan was throwing a massive party. It was a lavish, fully catered wine-tasting event for her superficial friends and a few key players from her fraudulent investment firm. She was prematurely celebrating the $20 million she firmly believed was only a few weeks away from landing in her offshore accounts. I could hear the sharp clinking of crystal glasses and the shrill, arrogant laughter of people drinking expensive champagne paid for by my stolen credit cards. Tyson was up there somewhere, undoubtedly standing quietly in a corner playing the role of the dutiful mute husband while his wife proudly spent his inheritance. Down in the damp, freezing basement, I was not drinking wine. I was meticulously organizing my old leather tool belt. I had a pair of insulated wire cutters, a thick roll of electrical tape, a high-powered magnetic screwdriver, and a heavy rubber mallet. I checked the glowing dial of my wristwatch. It was exactly 10:45 in the evening. The party above had reached its loud, chaotic peak. The hired catering staff would be busy clearing plates in the main kitchen, and the guests were heavily intoxicated, completely distracted by the loud music and the alcohol. It was the perfect cover for a ghost to walk through his own house. I moved quietly to the heavy wooden door at the top of the basement stairs. Megan had replaced the shattered deadbolt with a cheap brass padlock, genuinely thinking a $10 lock from a local hardware store could hold a master builder captive. I wedged the flathead screwdriver into the cheap metal casing and twisted my wrist sharply. The padlock snapped open with a dull crack easily masked by the heavy bass thumping from the living room directly overhead. I pushed the door open and stepped into the shadowy hallway of the first floor. I moved through the familiar corridors with absolute precision, avoiding the brightly illuminated foyer and slipping up the secondary servant staircase located in the back of the house. I had designed those specific stairs 30 years ago for privacy, and now they were my silent pathway to the master suite. I reached the second-floor landing without encountering a single soul. Down the hall, the massive double doors of the master bedroom were slightly ajar. I slipped inside and quietly clicked the brass lock shut behind me. The large room smelled sickeningly of Megan's expensive floral perfume. I walked straight past the king-sized bed and stepped into the massive walk-in closet. Pushing aside rows of her newly purchased designer dresses, I found the smooth, unpainted wooden panel at the very back of the space. I pressed my palm against the hidden latch, and the panel popped open, revealing the heavy matte black titanium safe bolted directly into the floor joists. The biometric fingerprint scanner glowed with a steady, arrogant red light. I knelt down on the carpet and pulled the insulated wire cutters from my heavy leather belt. I did not attack the titanium safe directly. Instead, I carefully removed the decorative baseboard trim running along the bottom of the closet wall. Behind the drywall, I found the primary 240-volt electrical conduit that fed the master suite's localized power grid. I knew this specific safe model drew its continuous power directly from this line, backed up by a small internal battery that only activated during complete power failures. I did not want a power failure. I wanted a massive localized electrical surge. I stripped the thick insulation off the live wires, my hands completely steady, despite the lethal voltage coursing just millimeters from my bare fingers. I took a heavy piece of copper grounding wire from my pouch and deliberately crossed the positive and negative terminals leading directly to the wall outlet powering the safe. A sharp, brilliant blue spark erupted inside the dark wall cavity, followed instantly by a loud, sharp pop. The localized breaker tripped immediately, plunging the closet into total darkness. but I kept my eyes fixed on the safe. For exactly 5 seconds, the internal motherboard panicked from the massive voltage spike. The glowing red scanner flashed violently green. A heavy mechanical click echoed from deep inside the titanium door. The emergency failsafe had successfully engaged. I grabbed the heavy chrome handle and pulled backward. The titanium door swung open smoothly on its well-oiled hinges. I pulled a small penlight from my coat pocket and clamped it firmly between my teeth, aiming the narrow beam of light into the dark cavity of the safe. There, resting on the top shelf alongside Megan's stolen diamond jewelry, was a thick, legal-sized manila envelope. I pulled it out and quickly opened the heavy brass clasp to check the contents. My rough fingers brushed against the crisp, heavy parchment of the original county-stamped property deeds. The municipal watermarks caught the faint light from my penlight, confirming their absolute authenticity. I had them. The $20 million transaction with Apex Holdings was now effectively paralyzed. But I could not just leave the safe empty. If Megan opened it tomorrow to retrieve a necklace and saw the massive envelope missing, she would immediately panic and accelerate her timeline, potentially moving me to the state-run nursing home the very next morning. I needed to buy myself the full 3 weeks to execute the rest of my plan. I reached into my winter coat pocket and pulled out an identical heavy manila envelope Jonathan Hayes had specifically prepared for me. Inside was a thick stack of worthless, outdated corporate tax filings from the late 90s, folded to match the exact weight and thickness of the original deeds. I slid the decoy envelope onto the top shelf, arranging it precisely where the original had been resting. I tucked the real property deed securely into the inside breast pocket of my coat, zipping it tight against my chest. I pushed the heavy titanium door shut. The internal locking mechanism engaged with a solid metallic thud. The biometric scanner remained completely dark, effectively fried by the electrical surge. She would assume the keypad battery simply died and call a technician eventually, but by the time they arrived to drill it open, it would be far too late. I quickly refitted the decorative baseboard trim perfectly, hiding the exposed electrical wires, and pushed the hidden closet panel back into place. I stood up, wiping a thin layer of white drywall dust from my dark trousers. The heist was absolutely flawless. I turned to walk out of the dark closet, ready to slip back down the servant stairs and disappear into the basement before anyone downstairs even knew I was gone. As I stepped out of the closet and back into the main area of the master bedroom, a sharp beam of bright light suddenly sliced across the dark carpet. The heavy oak door of the master ensuite bathroom, which I had assumed was completely empty, clicked and swung inward. A woman stepped out, wiping her hands on a small decorative guest towel. It was Chloe, Megan's absolute best friend and the most notorious gossip in her superficial social circle. She had clearly slipped upstairs to use the private restroom away from the crowded party below. Chloe froze her eyes, adjusting to the dim light of the bedroom. She stared directly at me, taking in my dusty clothes, the heavy tool belt strapped to my waist, and the undeniable fact that the supposedly demented banished father-in-law was standing freely in the middle of the master suite. The expensive guest towel dropped from her trembling hands, hitting the floor without a sound. She opened her mouth and let out a piercing, terrified scream that easily cut through the heavy bass of the music downstairs. Chloe let out a piercing, terrified scream that easily cut through the heavy bass of the music downstairs. I had mere seconds before the entire party rushed up the stairs to investigate the commotion. I pulled the thick parchment deeds from my breast pocket, my mind racing through all possible contingency plans. Resting on Megan's bedside table was a massive, decorative hardcover book about Italian Renaissance architecture, an expensive, heavy prop she had bought strictly for aesthetic purposes and had never actually read. I grabbed the book, cracked it open to the middle, and shoved the heavy manila envelope deep between the glossy pages. I snapped the book shut just as the heavy thumping of footsteps echoed up the main staircase. I needed to get the book out of the room instantly, but I had absolutely no time to reach the door. The master bedroom featured a large bay window overlooking the manicured front lawn. I quickly unlatched the lock, cracked the window open, tossed the heavy book out into the dark night, and slid the glass shut just as the master bedroom doors burst open. Megan stormed into the room, followed closely by 2 massive security guards she had hired for her lavish party. Her face was flushed with expensive wine and absolute fury. Chloe was still standing in the bathroom doorway, hyperventilating and pointing a trembling finger directly at my chest, unable to form a coherent sentence. Megan demanded to know what I was doing out of the basement and inside her private sanctuary. I did not flinch or show a single ounce of panic. I calmly unhooked a heavy wrench from my leather tool belt and gestured toward the master bathroom wall behind Chloe. I told Megan the main water valve behind the shower was leaking severely and the resulting water pressure was threatening to burst the pipes and flood the entire second floor. I claimed I heard the rushing water from the basement and used my emergency tools to prevent hundreds of thousands of dollars in water damage to her imported hardwood floors. Megan narrowed her eyes, completely rejecting my perfectly logical explanation. She knew I was a master builder, but she also knew I despised her deeply. She marched over to the closet and saw the decorative baseboard trim I had carefully replaced. She paused, noticing the faint lingering smell of ozone in the air from the electrical spark. She rushed into the closet and checked the biometric safe. The red scanning light was completely dead. She screamed in panic and demanded the guards open the safe immediately. One guard stepped forward and tried the handle, but the biometric lock was completely fried and the mechanical override was securely engaged. Megan rushed back out into the bedroom, her face twisted in absolute rage. She ordered the two massive security guards to search me immediately. They grabbed my arms, roughly pinning me against the expensive silk wallpaper, while they patted down every single pocket of my dark trousers and winter coat. They checked the pouches of my leather tool belt, throwing my tools onto the carpet. They found nothing but my wire cutters, electrical tape, and a few loose screws. I had cleverly hidden the burner phone back down in the basement lockbox before coming upstairs. I was completely clean. The heavy hardcover book containing the $20 million property deeds was currently resting safely in the damp grass 2 stories below. Megan paced the room like a caged animal, screaming that I was trying to steal from her and ruin her celebration. I kept my expression entirely neutral. I calmly reminded her that I was the one who built this house, and I knew the plumbing better than any expensive contractor she could ever hire. I told her she was welcome to wait for the pipes to burst and ruin her party, or she could let me finish my job. She refused to listen to a single word. She ordered the guards to drag me back down to the basement immediately and promised me that I would pay dearly for crossing her. The guards hauled me out of the room, forcing me down the servant stairs and locking the heavy door behind me. The night passed slowly in the freezing, damp basement. I did not sleep. I sat on the rusted metal cot waiting for the inevitable retaliation. At exactly 8 o'clock the next morning, the heavy basement door opened. Megan did not come down the stairs alone this time. She was accompanied by 2 uniformed city police officers and a man in a sharp suit holding a clipboard. Megan had clearly spent the entire night contacting an emergency on-call judge. She used the incident in the master bedroom combined with Chloe's hysterical witness testimony about a deranged old man breaking into the bathroom to secure an emergency eviction and a temporary restraining order. She had painted a vivid, highly fabricated picture of a violent, dementia-ridden father-in-law who was actively terrorizing her household and threatening her guests. The man with the clipboard was a court-appointed representative serving the official eviction notice. The police officers stood by silently, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts, ready to subdue me if I caused a scene. Megan looked down at me from the top of the stairs, her eyes gleaming with absolute victory. She commanded me to gather my clothes and leave the property immediately. She proudly announced that I was legally barred from coming within 500 feet of the estate. If I refused to leave the premises right now, the officers would arrest me for criminal trespassing and violating a strict court order. This was her final crushing blow. She genuinely thought she was stripping away my last shred of dignity by throwing me out onto the street with absolutely nothing to my name. I did not argue with the police officers. I did not beg Megan for mercy or try to explain the truth to the court representative. Arguments are for people who are actively losing the war. I quietly packed my few remaining clothes into a single cheap canvas duffel bag the guards had left behind. I slung the heavy leather tool belt over my shoulder and walked up the wooden stairs, passing by my son Tyson, who once again stood in the hallway and refused to meet my eyes. I walked out the grand front doors of the mansion I had built from the ground up, escorted closely by the 2 armed police officers. Megan stood on the sprawling front porch watching me walk down the long, sweeping driveway with a smug, triumphant smirk plastered on her face. She thought she had won the ultimate prize. As I reached the heavy iron front gates, the officers turned back toward the house, satisfied that I was leaving peacefully. I stepped out onto the public sidewalk and took a deep breath of the crisp morning air. I walked slowly along the wrought iron fence line, keeping my eyes fixed on the manicured bushes lining the property. Right below the master bedroom window, hidden perfectly within the tall, decorative, ornamental grass, was the massive hardcover book about Italian Renaissance architecture. I crouched down, reached through the cold iron bars, and pulled the heavy book out of the damp morning foliage. I opened the glossy pages. The thick manila envelope containing the original property deeds was perfectly intact, completely untouched by the overnight dew. I tucked the envelope securely inside my winter coat, zipping it tight against my chest, and left the expensive book resting in the dirt. I adjusted the strap of my duffel bag and began walking down the quiet suburban street toward the city. Megan thought she had successfully thrown me out like garbage, but she had actually just handed me the absolute freedom to orchestrate her complete destruction without any interference. I smiled. I walked for 3 miles until I reached the commuter train station on the edge of the suburbs. The biting morning wind whipped against my face, but I did not feel the cold. I felt a quiet, burning energy radiating from the thick manila envelope tucked securely inside my coat. The morning commute was a blur of tired faces and spilled coffee. But I sat in the corner of the train car with absolute unwavering focus. By 9 o'clock, I was stepping off the elevator onto the 40th floor of the downtown high-rise that housed Jonathan Hayes's private law firm. The receptionist recognized me immediately despite my wrinkled clothes and the cheap canvas duffel bag slung over my shoulder. She ushered me straight into Jonathan's corner office without a single question. Jonathan was already sitting at his massive mahogany desk aggressively reviewing the Gavin Brooks dossier. He looked up, his eyes widening slightly at my disheveled appearance. I did not waste time with pleasantries or complaints about my eviction. I unzipped my winter coat, reached into my breast pocket, and pulled out the original county-stamped property deeds. I tossed the heavy envelope onto the center of his desk. It landed with a loud, satisfying thud. Jonathan carefully opened the brass clasp and inspected the municipal watermarks, a slow, triumphant smile spreading across his face. He leaned back in his leather chair, exhaling a breath he seemed to have been holding since our midnight meeting. He told me the $20 million sale to Apex Holdings was effectively dead in the water, as no legitimate escrow service would ever release funds without these exact documents. I shook my head, my expression hardening. I told him stopping the sale was simply not enough. I did not just want to block Megan. I wanted to trap her inside a financial cage so complex and legally binding that she would never see the outside of a federal courtroom again. I told Jonathan it was time to open the black box. Jonathan frowned, clearly confused by my statement. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawling Chicago skyline, tracing the outlines of the commercial buildings I had built with my own 2 hands. I reminded Jonathan that a man does not survive 40 years in the cutthroat, unforgiving world of commercial real estate without establishing a few deeply buried contingency plans. Back in 1998, during a particularly volatile period in the global market, I had quietly established an offshore shell company incorporated in the Cayman Islands. It was completely legal, fully compliant with international tax laws, and entirely insulated from my personal domestic identity. I called the entity Vanguard Horizon. The corporate structure was a labyrinth of blind trusts and proxy directors purposefully designed to be an impenetrable financial fortress. Most importantly, Vanguard Horizon was never tied to my social security number or my primary domestic estate. Therefore, Megan's forged power of attorney had absolutely no jurisdiction over it. For 25 years, Vanguard Horizon had sat dormant, quietly accruing interest on a substantial initial deposit, maintaining a pristine, untouchable credit rating and massive liquid capital. I turned back to Jonathan and instructed him to activate Vanguard Horizon immediately. His eyes widened as he grasped the sheer magnitude of the weapon I was unsheathing. He quickly pulled up the secure banking portals on his encrypted computer, entering a series of complex authentication codes I provided from memory. When the offshore account balances populated on his screen, the total liquid capital available was staggering. I explained my strategy with cold, calculated precision. We were not going to simply file an injunction against Apex Holdings to stop the sale of my properties. Apex Holdings was a mid-sized private equity firm notoriously aggressive, but currently heavily over-leveraged in the volatile commercial market. They were incredibly vulnerable to a hostile acquisition. I instructed Jonathan to use the massive untraceable capital of Vanguard Horizon to immediately initiate a rapid, highly aggressive buyout of Apex Holdings itself. We were going to swallow the predator whole. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in ruthless financial warfare, orchestrated entirely from the secure confines of Jonathan's downtown office. We operated in absolute terrifying secrecy. Jonathan deployed a small army of proxy attorneys and corporate sharks to aggressively purchase the outstanding debt of Apex Holdings. We targeted their primary institutional investors, offering premium cash buyouts through Vanguard Horizon that were simply too lucrative for them to refuse. Because Apex Holdings was struggling with severe liquidity issues, a fact we uncovered during our deep dive into their public financial filings, their board of directors was desperate for a massive influx of capital to avoid bankruptcy. They viewed Vanguard Horizon as a mysterious but incredibly welcome savior, completely unaware that the man orchestrating the hostile takeover was the very same elderly man whose real estate portfolio they were currently trying to strip mine. We leveraged the purchase debt to force an emergency shareholder vote, systematically replacing their key board members with proxy directors entirely loyal to Vanguard Horizon. By Thursday afternoon, the rapid acquisition was officially complete. We had successfully executed a flawless corporate coup. Vanguard Horizon now owned a controlling 68% stake in Apex Holdings. Jonathan sat back in his chair, staring at the finalized digital contracts on his high-resolution monitors, almost in disbelief at the speed and sheer brutality of the maneuver. He printed out the final executive summary and slid it across the mahogany desk toward me. I picked up the heavy fountain pen and signed my name on the proxy agreement, officially sealing the transaction under the impenetrable veil of the shell company. The trap was fully constructed, the steel jaws pulled back and locked securely into place. I stood up and walked back to the massive office windows, looking down at the busy city streets below. A profound, icy calm settled deeply into my chest. The dynamic of power had just shifted so violently that the shockwave had not even reached the surface yet. Megan was currently sitting in my mansion, drinking my expensive wine and eagerly counting the days until she could sell my $20 million real estate portfolio to Apex Holdings. She genuinely believed she was a brilliant criminal mastermind who had successfully outsmarted a fragile, dementia-ridden old man. She had absolutely no idea that the massive corporate entity she was desperately trying to sell my stolen buildings to was no longer an independent company. She was completely oblivious to the fact that she was actively preparing to negotiate the final fraudulent transaction with the very man she had banished to the basement and evicted onto the street. I was now secretly the controlling boss of Apex Holdings. When the time came to sign the final paperwork and hand over the property deeds, she would not be dealing with a faceless corporate board of directors. She would be dealing directly with me. I pulled the burner phone from my coat pocket and looked at the blank screen, feeling the satisfying weight of absolute, undeniable control. I had meticulously paved the road to her destruction. Now all I had to do was send a single, carefully crafted message to ensure she drove her stolen life straight off the cliff. The physical takeover of Apex Holdings was complete, but I knew that crushing Megan financially would not be enough. I needed to dismantle her entirely, starting with the fragile, pathetic foundation of her marriage to my son. During Jonathan's exhaustive investigation into her financial history, we uncovered a fascinating piece of information she had desperately tried to keep buried. Before she sank her claws into Tyson, Megan had been involved with a man who ran a shady underground sports betting ring. Even more interesting was the fact that for the past 6 months she had been quietly wiring thousands of dollars from Tyson's personal accounts directly to this ex-boyfriend. It was the perfect wedge. I had Jonathan compile the wire transfer receipts complete with dates, amounts, and the ex-boyfriend's name clearly highlighted in red ink. We placed the documents inside a stark, unmarked manila envelope. I hired a private courier to deliver it directly to Tyson's desk at his mid-level corporate management job. I did not include a note. I simply let the undeniable paper trail speak for itself. I knew my son. He was weak and easily manipulated, but he was also deeply insecure. The moment he tore open that envelope and saw the name of another man siphoning his money, the seed of absolute paranoia would be planted. I could picture him sitting in his sterile office cubicle, his hands shaking as the illusion of his perfect dominant wife began to violently crack right in front of his eyes. He had sold out his own father to appease her, and now he was staring at concrete proof that she was playing him for an absolute fool. The courier texted Jonathan a confirmation photo of the delivery at noon. The psychological warfare had officially begun. I knew exactly how the confrontation would unfold when Tyson returned to the mansion that evening. My private investigator Marcus had managed to clone Tyson's phone records and keep a close eye on their movements, but I did not even need surveillance to predict Megan's reaction. Tyson marched into the house, clutching the manila envelope, finally attempting to summon the backbone he never had when it came to defending me. He confronted her in the grand living room, throwing the wire transfer receipts onto the expensive glass coffee table. He demanded to know why she was funneling his money to a known criminal she used to sleep with. For a brief second, Megan was cornered. But predators like her have a terrifying ability to instantly adapt. Instead of screaming or denying the transfers, she immediately weaponized her tears. She collapsed onto the sofa, sobbing uncontrollably, burying her face in her hands. She spun a brilliant, deeply manipulative lie. She claimed the ex-boyfriend was a dangerous, violent man who had been viciously blackmailing her over a past mistake. She cried that she only paid him to protect Tyson from getting hurt, insisting she was bearing this terrible burden entirely alone because she loved him too much to put him in danger. It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation, shifting herself from a cheating thief into a tragic, self-sacrificing victim. And Tyson, true to his pathetic nature, folded completely. The manufactured tears extinguished his rare spark of anger. He sat down next to her, apologizing for doubting her, wrapping his arms around the woman who was actively destroying his life. He smoothed her hair, promising that they would face this imaginary threat together. She wiped her fake tears, resting her head on his shoulder, her eyes cold and calculating behind his back. The crack in their marriage had been temporarily patched with a desperate lie, but the structural integrity was permanently compromised. Tyson wanted to believe he was her protector, completely blind to the fact that she was the only real danger in the room. Despite his desperate desire to believe his wife, the seed of doubt I planted had taken root deep within Tyson's anxious mind. The forged power of attorney and the impending $20 million sale of my real estate portfolio were the only things holding their fragile world together. If the money was real, he could forgive the lies. But his paranoia drove him to do something highly uncharacteristic. He decided to independently verify the status of the Apex Holdings acquisition. The following morning, while Megan was out shopping for designer clothes with my stolen credit cards, Tyson locked himself in his home office and dialed the main corporate number for Apex Holdings. He nervously identified himself as the husband of the primary seller and asked to speak directly with the CEO to confirm the closing date of the escrow account. The corporate secretary on the other end of the line was polite but firm. She informed Tyson that the previous CEO had unexpectedly stepped down 2 days ago following a massive confidential corporate restructuring. Tyson felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. He asked who was currently in charge of finalizing their $20 million real estate transaction. The secretary casually checked her schedule and replied that all high-level acquisitions were now being personally overseen by the new majority shareholder and acting chairman. She stated she was not authorized to release his full legal name, but all internal memorandums simply referred to him as Mr. D. Tyson thanked her abruptly and hung up the phone. The blood drained completely from his face. The initial D was common enough, but the timing was a catastrophic coincidence that his deeply paranoid mind could not simply ignore. Unable to shake the terrifying dread pooling in his stomach, Tyson wandered aimlessly through the massive, quiet house. His footsteps eventually led him to the basement door. He stared at the broken padlock, a stark reminder of the cruelty he had permitted in this very home. He slowly walked down the wooden stairs, stepping into the damp, freezing space where they had imprisoned me. He looked at the rusted metal cot and the empty trash bags scattered across the concrete floor. He was looking for reassurance, a sign that the old man was truly gone and powerless. Instead, as he kicked at a pile of discarded drywall dust near the center of the room, a small metallic object caught the dim light of the single overhead bulb. Tyson crouched down and picked it up. It was a heavy custom-made silver cufflink. I had deliberately dropped it there the night I executed the biometric safe heist, a silent calling card left behind for whoever was foolish enough to look closely. Tyson rubbed the dirt off the polished silver surface. Engraved deeply into the metal was a distinct, elegant monogram featuring a single, bold letter D. Tyson stared at the cufflink, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic. The terrifying pieces of the puzzle suddenly violently snapped into place in his mind. The mysterious new chairman of Apex Holdings was not a stranger. The anonymous package exposing his wife was not a coincidence. He realized with absolute horrifying clarity that his father was not a helpless victim wandering the streets. His father was Mr. D, and he was orchestrating something so massive and destructive that their stolen empire was already crumbling beneath their feet. The morning of the massive $20 million transaction arrived with a heavy, overcast Chicago sky. But inside my former home office, Megan was basking in the artificial glow of absolute victory. She sat behind my massive mahogany desk, dressed in a sharp white designer suit, looking every inch the successful corporate executive she desperately pretended to be. Tyson stood nervously near the doorway, his eyes darting around the room, his hands sweating. He had spent the entire weekend completely consumed by paranoia after finding my silver cufflink in the basement. He had tried in his own weak and trembling way to warn her. He had stammered out his terrifying theory about the anonymous package, the sudden change in Apex Holdings leadership, and the mysterious Mr. D overseeing the sale. Megan had laughed right in his face. She called him a pathetic coward, insisting that his father was currently rotting on a cot in a state-run asylum and could not possibly orchestrate a corporate buyout. She was completely blinded by the finish line. The glowing screen of my custom desktop computer displayed the final legally binding acquisition contracts from Apex Holdings. The digital signature fields were highlighted in bright yellow, waiting for her authorization. Megan did not bother to read the dense legal clauses or the attached addendums meticulously drafted by Jonathan Hayes. She only looked at the purchase price bolded at the top of the page, $20 million. She took a deep breath, grabbed the wireless mouse, and clicked the digital signature box. She applied the forged power of attorney authorization with a final decisive keystroke. She hit the submit button. The screen flashed a bright green confirmation message. Megan threw her hands up in the air and let out a loud, triumphant cheer, completely ignoring her husband, who looked like he was about to physically vomit from anxiety. Less than 60 seconds after she submitted the digitally signed contracts, Megan's encrypted offshore banking application chimed loudly from her smartphone resting on the desk. She snatched the phone up, her eyes wide with greedy anticipation. She opened the application and gasped. Right there on the high-resolution screen, pending in her private account ledger, was a deposit for $20 million. The sheer magnitude of the number, with all its zeros, completely validated every single criminal act she had committed over the past 2 months. She turned to Tyson aggressively, shoving the phone screen into his pale face, screaming that she had done it and that they were officially incredibly rich. But her arrogant celebration was violently cut short. Before her eyes, the bright green deposit text suddenly shifted to a harsh, flashing red. A heavy padlock icon materialized directly over the massive financial figure. The available balance at the top of the screen remained at 0. A new automated email notification popped up on her computer monitor, sent directly from the elite legal compliance division of Apex Holdings. Megan dropped her phone onto the desk and grabbed the mouse, hurriedly clicking the email open. The corporate message was written in dense, uncompromising legal terminology. It explicitly stated that due to the extreme financial magnitude of the real estate acquisition standard, corporate security protocols had been automatically triggered. The entire $20 million payment was now permanently locked inside a secure third-party escrow holding account. The funds were cryptographically sealed. Megan scrolled frantically through the email, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. She was looking for a digital button to click, a phone number to call, anything to release the hold and let the money flow into her hands. But there was no quick fix. The money was sitting right in front of her face, entirely untouchable. Megan slammed her fists onto the mahogany desk, cursing loudly at the computer screen. She forced herself to carefully read the strict release conditions outlined at the very bottom of the escrow notification. The legal department of Apex Holdings demanded one final non-negotiable step before the $20 million could be legally unfrozen and transferred into her possession. The system required a physical in-person handover of the original county-stamped property deeds. The digital signatures were sufficient to initiate the transfer, but the physical documents were required to finalize the legal change of ownership. Megan scoffed in profound annoyance. She viewed this as a minor, frustrating administrative hurdle rather than a catastrophic failure. She angrily told Tyson to stop hovering like a frightened child and follow her upstairs. She marched out of the home office and headed straight for the master suite. Earlier that week, she had paid a high-end commercial locksmith a small fortune to drill out the biometric scanner I had intentionally fried, granting her full access to the floor-mounted titanium safe once again. She walked into the massive walk-in closet, pulled open the heavy titanium door, and reached inside. She grabbed the thick manila envelope resting securely on the top shelf. She did not even look closely at it. She just pulled the heavy brass clasp open and yanked the documents out, ready to shove them into her designer briefcase. But as the papers slid into her hands, the tactile sensation was entirely wrong. Instead of the crisp, heavy texture of official municipal parchment, she was holding thin, faded printer paper. She looked down at the documents in her hands. The bold headings did not read Deed of Trust. They read Corporate Tax Return 1998. Megan froze. The blood drained entirely from her face, leaving her skin a sickly, terrifying white. She threw the worthless tax documents onto the closet floor and dropped to her knees, frantically tearing the safe apart. She pulled out her jewelry boxes, her cash reserves, and every other piece of paper, desperately searching for the missing deeds. They were gone. In a horrifying flash of realization, she remembered the night of her party. She remembered Chloe screaming. She remembered me standing in this exact room wearing my tool belt, claiming I was fixing a leaking pipe. I had not been fixing anything. I had completely robbed her blind right under her nose. Megan collapsed back onto the plush closet carpet surrounded by the scattered, worthless tax papers. She was hyperventilating, her perfectly manicured nails digging deeply into her own palms. The $20 million was locked behind an impenetrable escrow wall, and the only key to unlock it was currently in the possession of the man she had just violently evicted onto the street. Tyson stood in the closet doorway, his worst fears completely confirmed, quietly suggesting they needed to run away before the authorities got involved. But Megan was far too gone. The greed had completely consumed her rational mind. She could not accept defeat when $20 million was sitting just one step away. She refused to walk away empty-handed after sacrificing everything to get this far. She pulled her smartphone from her blazer pocket, her hands shaking violently. Instead of calling a lawyer or accepting that she had been utterly outplayed, she chose to cross the point of absolutely no return. She dialed a highly encrypted number she had saved deep in her contacts. It was a dark web connection she had utilized years ago during her underground sports betting days, a man who specialized in manufacturing flawless, high-level corporate forgeries. When the man answered, she did not hesitate. She ordered a complete, flawless recreation of the commercial property deeds, demanding the highest quality municipal watermarks and offering to pay whatever exorbitant fee he required for a 24-hour rush delivery. She hung up the phone and looked up at Tyson with wild, psychotic eyes. She told him the money was theirs and she was not going to let a senile old man take it away. She did not realize that by commissioning those fake deeds, she was upgrading her crime from local state fraud to massive federal corporate wire fraud. She had just locked herself inside the exact cage I had built for her. The next morning, a discreet courier on a motorcycle arrived at the front iron gate of the estate. He did not bring the forged documents. Those had been delivered hours earlier through a highly secure dead drop, a flawless counterfeit package that cost Megan $50,000 of Tyson's completely drained savings. The new courier carried something far more intimidating. He handed Megan a thick, heavy envelope made of textured golden cardstock sealed with a crimson wax stamp bearing the official imposing crest of Apex Holdings. Megan tore it open, her manicured fingers trembling slightly from the sheer anticipation. Inside was a single, heavily embossed letter printed on premium corporate parchment. It was not a polite request or a standard corporate update. It was a strict, non-negotiable demand. The executive board of Apex Holdings, under the direct authority of the newly appointed chairman, required an immediate, in-person meeting to physically authenticate the property deeds and finalize the release of the $20 million escrow hold. The letter explicitly stated that failure to comply with this physical verification process by the end of the business day would result in the immediate cancellation of the entire acquisition and guarantee severe legal action for breach of contract. Megan held the golden letter, her eyes scanning the sharp, unforgiving text. The initial wave of panic she felt was quickly replaced by a massive surge of arrogant adrenaline. She had the forged deeds resting securely on my mahogany desk in the study. She believed they were absolutely perfect, completely undetectable to the naked eye of any corporate lawyer. She viewed this demand not as a trap, but as the final glorious victory lap of her brilliant scheme. She was convinced she was about to cross the finish line and claim her ultimate prize. Megan eagerly scanned the bottom of the embossed letter to find the specific address for this ultimate corporate showdown. She fully expected to be summoned to a towering glass skyscraper in the downtown financial district, perhaps a high-security boardroom with panoramic views of the city skyline. Instead, her eyes widened in profound shock as she read the engraved location. The meeting was not scheduled at a remote corporate headquarters. The time was set for precisely 8 o'clock that evening, and the designated location was her current residence, my custom-built mansion. The letter coldly explained that due to the extreme financial magnitude of the transaction and the highly sensitive nature of the physical documents, the chairman preferred the absolute privacy and controlled environment of the seller's primary estate. Megan let out a sharp, triumphant laugh that echoed through the empty hallway. She completely misinterpreted the tactical maneuver. She saw this as the ultimate sign of submission from a massive corporate giant. They were not making her travel to them like a common employee. They were coming directly to her house, bowing to her newly acquired status to personally hand her $20 million. Tyson, however, did not share her psychotic enthusiasm. He paced the living room floor, his face slick with nervous sweat. He pointed out the sheer, terrifying absurdity of a billionaire private equity CEO traveling to the residential suburbs for a routine paperwork handover. He frantically reminded her of the silver cufflink he had found in the basement, begging her to consider that this was a massive, meticulously orchestrated trap designed by his own father. Megan silenced him with a vicious slap across the face, using the exact same brutal force she had used to strike me. She called him a pathetic, paranoid coward. She ordered him to stop whining, fix his posture, and start preparing the house to host the most important guests of their entire miserable lives. As the sun dipped below the Chicago skyline, casting long, dark shadows across the manicured lawns of the estate, the atmosphere inside the mansion reached a fever pitch of suffocating tension. Megan had spent the entire afternoon transforming herself into the ultimate image of untouchable elite wealth. She was dressed in a stunning jet black couture gown that cost more than most working families earned in an entire year. Her hair was styled flawlessly, and her neck was heavily adorned with my late wife's stolen diamond necklace. She looked exactly like a ruthless queen preparing to officially ascend her golden throne. She had forced Tyson into a tailored charcoal gray tuxedo, but no amount of expensive Italian fabric could hide the absolute terror radiating from his rigid posture. He looked like a condemned man walking slowly toward the gallows, constantly checking his gold watch and glancing nervously at the large front windows. At exactly 7:55, the eerie silence of the quiet suburban street was violently shattered by the deep, synchronized rumble of heavy, high-performance engines. Megan rushed to the Grand Bay window and gasped in sheer delight. A convoy of 4 massive matte black armored SUVs turned smoothly into the long, sweeping driveway, their bright halogen headlights cutting sharply through the evening darkness. They did not park haphazardly. They arranged themselves in a tight, tactical defensive formation that completely blocked the main iron gates. Men in immaculate dark suits stepped out of the vehicles, simultaneously moving with a terrifying, silent military precision. They did not look like standard corporate attorneys or soft financial advisors. They looked like the absolute manifestation of raw, unchecked power. Megan gripped the thick manila envelope containing the forged deeds, her heart pounding with a toxic, overwhelming mix of fear and pure greed. She turned to Tyson, grabbing his arm forcefully, and ordered him to stand up straight and act like he actually belonged in the room. Megan and Tyson stood frozen in the grand foyer, waiting anxiously for the heavy brass doorbell to ring. It never did. Instead, the heavy handle of the front door simply turned and one of the massive suited men stepped inside the house as if he legally owned the property. He did not offer a polite greeting, a handshake, or a business card. He locked his cold, dead eyes onto Megan and silently extended his muscular arm, gesturing rigidly down the main hallway toward the formal dining room. The entire house suddenly felt unnervingly cold, completely stripped of the warmth and vibrant life I had spent decades carefully building into its walls. Megan lifted her chin, projecting a desperate false mask of absolute confidence, and strutted forward. Her designer heels clicked aggressively against the imported hardwood floor, holding the forged documents tightly against her chest like a protective, bulletproof shield. Tyson followed exactly 2 steps behind her, his breathing shallow and incredibly ragged, his terrified eyes darting frantically at the silent men actively securing the perimeter of his home. They stepped through the grand arched threshold into the massive dining room. The sprawling space was completely dark, the heavy velvet curtains drawn tightly shut against the night. The only source of illumination was a single flickering silver candelabra placed in the exact center of the long mahogany table, casting long, distorted shadows against the expensive silk wallpaper. As soon as Tyson's back foot crossed the threshold, the illusion of Megan's control instantly shattered into a million pieces. The heavy, solid oak doors behind them swung shut with terrifying, violent speed. A loud, heavy, mechanical deadbolt, one that my men had personally installed that very afternoon, slid into place with a definitive, inescapable click. They were locked inside the dark room. The heavy mechanical deadbolt echoed through the dark dining room with the finality of a prison cell closing. For exactly 5 seconds, the massive space was plunged into absolute suffocating darkness. I sat perfectly still at the head of the long mahogany table, listening to the frantic, shallow breathing of my son and the sharp gasp of my daughter-in-law. Then I reached out and flipped the brass switch installed discreetly under the edge of the table. The massive crystal chandelier hanging directly above me blazed to life, in an instant flooding the room with brilliant, blinding light. Megan shielded her eyes with her free hand, her designer heels planted firmly on the imported rug. As her vision adjusted to the sudden brightness, her expression shifted from defensive caution to eager anticipation. She stood up perfectly straight, smoothing the fabric of her black couture gown, fully expecting to greet the billionaire chief executive officer of Apex Holdings. She had rehearsed her opening pitch 1,000 times in her head, but the man sitting in the high-backed leather chair at the head of the table was not a stranger in a corporate suit. It was me. I was dressed in a meticulously tailored charcoal suit, the exact same suit she had ordered her hired security guards to throw into a trash bag just a few days ago. I rested my hands on the polished wood of the table, my posture radiating the absolute authority of a man who had built every single inch of the fortress surrounding them. I did not smile. I simply stared at her, watching the horrifying realization wash over her carefully contoured face. Her eyes widened to the size of coins, her jaw dropping slightly, as her brain desperately tried to process the visual impossibility standing right in front of her. The frail, dementia-ridden old man she had violently evicted onto the street was sitting on the throne she had tried to steal. The profound shock paralyzed Megan for several long, agonizing seconds. Then her supreme arrogance, the very flaw that had driven her straight into my trap, forcefully reasserted itself. She let out a sharp, hysterical laugh that bounced off the silk-lined walls of the dining room. She pointed a trembling finger wrapped in my late wife's stolen diamonds directly at my chest. She wildly assumed I had somehow bypassed the perimeter security, broken into the house through a basement window, and staged this elaborate stunt just to ruin her massive corporate handover. Her voice escalated into a manic, piercing shriek as she demanded to know how I had gotten past the armed guards outside. She reached into her expensive clutch purse and pulled out her smartphone, jabbing her thumb aggressively at the screen. She proudly declared that she was calling the local police to have me arrested for criminal trespassing, burglary, and violating a strict court-mandated restraining order. She screamed that the real executives from Apex Holdings were going to walk through those locked doors at any second, and they would personally witness her sending a deranged, bitter old man to a maximum security psychiatric ward. Next to her, Tyson was completely falling apart. He did not laugh, and he did not reach for his phone. He looked at my tailored suit, the silver cufflink gleaming on my wrist, and the calm, terrifying control I held over the room. He grabbed Megan's arm, begging her in a terrified whisper to stop talking and just turn around. Megan violently yanked her arm away from her husband, cursing at her phone because the screen displayed absolutely zero cellular service. I had activated a military-grade signal jammer hidden in the dining room walls exactly 10 minutes before they walked in. She was completely cut off from the outside world, trapped in a soundproof room with the man she had tried to destroy. She slammed her phone onto the mahogany table, her chest heaving with furious indignation, demanding that I unlock the doors and leave her house immediately. I remained completely unfazed by her manic screaming. I slowly reached for the crystal wine glass resting to my right. It was a rare vintage Bordeaux I had specifically saved for a moment of absolute triumph. I lifted the glass to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the rich flavor settle before placing the glass softly back onto the table. The quiet clinking of the crystal was the only sound in the room, slicing right through her frantic energy. I looked directly into her wild, desperate eyes and spoke with a voice as cold and hard as concrete. I told her there was no need to worry about the police because the authorities were already intimately involved in this transaction. I explained that she was severely mistaken about the guest list for this evening. The executives from Apex Holdings were not running late, nor were they stuck in downtown traffic. I told her she was looking directly at the controlling majority shareholder of Vanguard Horizon, the offshore parent company that had aggressively acquired Apex Holdings 2 days ago. I watched the blood completely drain from her face as the sheer magnitude of my words finally penetrated her arrogant delusion. The $20 million real estate deal she was desperately trying to close was entirely controlled by me, She was trying to sell my stolen buildings back to the very man who owned them. Her knees buckled slightly, her hands gripping the edge of the table to keep herself from collapsing onto the floor. Before she could formulate a single word of denial, I calmly reached out and pressed a small, sleek silver button integrated into the wooden console next to my plate. A deep, mechanical hum vibrated through the floorboards. To my left, the massive custom-built sliding mahogany doors leading to my private library began to slowly glide open, revealing the pitch-black darkness of the adjacent room. Megan and Tyson spun their heads toward the mechanical sound, their eyes wide with absolute primal terror. They stared into the dark void of the library, completely paralyzed by the unknown. The heavy doors locked open with a solid thud. The soft, ambient lights of the library automatically flickered on, casting long shadows onto the dining room floor. Heavy footsteps echoed against the hardwood as 3 distinct figures stepped out of the room and into the bright light of the crystal chandelier. I did not need to introduce them. Their mere presence in this house was a devastating execution order for Megan's entire future. The first man to step forward was Jonathan Hayes, my brilliant, ruthless attorney, clutching a thick leather briefcase packed with irrefutable evidence of corporate espionage and forgery. The second man physically stumbled into the light, his cheap suit drenched in nervous sweat, his eyes fixed firmly on the floor. It was Gavin Brooks, the corrupt public notary Megan had bribed to forge the power of attorney. Gavin looked like a man walking directly to his own execution, completely broken and ready to testify to every single illegal detail to save his own skin. But it was the third man who finally broke Megan. He was tall, dressed in a sharp gray suit, possessing a cold, calculating demeanor that radiated absolute federal authority. He reached into his breast pocket and casually flipped open a leather wallet, exposing a gleaming silver badge. He was a senior special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specializing in interstate wire fraud and massive corporate theft. The golden invitation to this dinner was not a corporate handover. It was a carefully designed, inescapable federal sting operation. The 3 uninvited guests stepped up to the mahogany table, forming a solid wall of absolute destruction, officially sealing my daughter-in-law's fate forever. The heavy leather of Jonathan Hayes's briefcase hit the polished mahogany table with a sound like a gavel striking a judge's block. The sharp noise made Megan violently flinch, her stolen diamonds rattling against her collarbone. Jonathan did not offer a polite smile or a professional greeting. He adjusted his tailored suit jacket and looked at her with the absolute disdain usually reserved for cockroaches. He introduced himself clearly, ensuring every single syllable echoed in the silent, locked room. He stated he was my primary legal counsel, and he had spent the last 48 hours completely dismantling her pathetic illusion of a corporate takeover. Megan tried to open her mouth to speak, perhaps to deploy another calculated lie or a screaming threat, but her vocal cords completely failed her. Her eyes darted wildly away from Jonathan and locked onto the miserable, sweating figure standing trembling just a few steps behind him. Gavin Brooks looked worse than he had in the dimly lit dive bar. He was visibly shaking his cheap suit stained with nervous perspiration, unable to even look Megan in the eye. Jonathan grabbed Gavin by the shoulder and shoved him slightly forward into the harsh light of the crystal chandelier. I asked Gavin to explain exactly why he was attending this formal dinner party. The disgraced notary swallowed hard, his voice cracking pitifully in the quiet room. He looked directly at the floor and confessed everything out loud. He admitted that Megan had paid him $10,000 in untraceable cryptocurrency to illegally stamp the forged power of attorney. He explicitly confessed to signing the fraudulent medical affidavit that claimed I was mentally incompetent. Megan turned a sickening shade of gray. The very man she had hired to build the foundation of her criminal empire was now actively tearing it down right in front of her face. Before Megan could launch into a desperate denial or accuse Gavin of lying, the third man stepped smoothly into the center of the room. He did not possess the nervous, sweating energy of the notary or the aggressive legal posture of my attorney. He radiated the terrifying, quiet calm of an apex predator who had already cornered its prey. He reached into the breast pocket of his sharp gray suit, pulled out a thick leather wallet, and casually flipped it open. A heavy silver shield gleamed under the dining room lights. He introduced himself as Special Agent Caldwell of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specifically assigned to the Division of Corporate Theft and Massive Interstate Wire Fraud. He did not raise his voice. He spoke with the clinical, terrifying precision of a surgeon explaining a fatal, incurable diagnosis. He informed Megan that the Bureau had been actively monitoring her digital footprint for the past 72 hours. He explicitly detailed how the initial forgery of my signature constituted severe state-level fraud, but her desperate actions over the last 24 hours had violently escalated the situation into a massive federal nightmare. Agent Caldwell explained that the moment she used a digital banking network to transmit a digitally forged signature for a $20 million transaction, she committed felony wire fraud. He then delivered the most devastating blow. He pointed to the thick manila envelope Megan was still clutching tightly against her couture gown. He calmly revealed that the dark web contact she had desperately hired to manufacture the counterfeit municipal property deeds was actually a known federal informant. The high-speed courier who had dropped the fake documents at the Iron Gate earlier that morning was an undercover federal agent. The entire process of acquiring those fake deeds had been monitored, recorded, and officially logged into federal evidence. Megan was not just caught in a lie. She was caught holding the physical proof of a multi-million-dollar federal conspiracy, securely trapped in a room with the exact authorities required to lock her away for decades. The sheer weight of the federal agent's words physically crushed Megan. Her legs buckled slightly, forcing her to lean heavily against the edge of the mahogany table just to stay upright. The forged deeds slipped from her trembling fingers, spilling across the polished wood like worthless trash. It was finally my turn to deliver the killing strike. I stood up slowly from my leather chair at the head of the table. I reached inside my tailored suit jacket and pulled out a pristine, heavy stack of authentic corporate documents. I dropped them directly on top of her scattered, worthless forgeries. I did not yell or gloat. I kept my voice incredibly soft, forcing her to strain her ears to hear the exact mechanics of her total destruction. I told her to look at the top page. I told her to read the bold, undeniable print of the master shareholder agreement. With shaking hands, Megan pushed herself up and looked down at the documents. The bright lights illuminated the official, legally binding acquisition contracts of Apex Holdings. I explained to her that she had fundamentally underestimated my reach, my intelligence, and my ruthless capacity for revenge. I detailed how I used Vanguard Horizon, an offshore shell company I had established 25 years ago, to execute a hostile all-cash takeover of the very private equity firm she was desperately trying to negotiate with. I watched her eyes frantically scan the papers, reading the name of the new majority shareholder and acting chairman of the board. I proudly introduced myself as Mr. D. I explained that there was no anonymous corporate board waiting to hand her $20 million. There was only me. I had completely purchased the massive corporate predator that she thought was going to save her. The absolute magnitude of her own stupidity finally pierced through her thick armor of arrogant delusion. Megan stared at the corporate documents on the table, her mind violently short-circuiting as she connected the final terrifying dots of my master plan. She realized with horrifying clarity exactly what she had just done. She had illegally stolen a $20 million commercial real estate portfolio from an elderly man she despised. Then, driven by blind, unadulterated greed and a desperate need to unlock the escrow funds, she had engaged in massive federal wire fraud and commissioned counterfeit government documents, just so she could sell those exact same stolen buildings directly back to the very man she stole them from. She had actively funded and orchestrated her own federal sting operation, paying tens of thousands of dollars for the ultimate privilege of handing herself over to the FBI. She was completely boxed in by her own unforgivable actions. The air in the dining room felt impossibly thin. Megan slowly turned her head, looking wildly around the room for any possible escape route, any legal loophole, or any gullible person she could manipulate to shift the blame. She locked her terrified eyes with Tyson, desperately hoping her weak-willed husband would somehow step forward and sacrifice himself to save her from federal prison. But Tyson was physically backing away from her, his hands raised defensively in the air, his face pale with absolute terror as he pressed his back firmly against the locked oak doors. He was abandoning her to the wolves without a single second of hesitation. Megan stood entirely alone at the table, completely surrounded by the men who had just flawlessly engineered the absolute end of her life. The instinct for self-preservation completely overwrote any lingering trace of marital loyalty in my daughter-in-law. Megan was entirely cornered, staring at the physical manifestation of her ruined life, and she immediately looked for a scapegoat to absorb the catastrophic damage. Her chest heaved rapidly under her expensive couture gown as she frantically scanned the room. She looked at the federal agent, then at my attorney, and finally locked her wild eyes onto her husband cowering by the heavy oak doors. She raised her trembling hand and pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at Tyson. Her voice, previously a breathless gasp of terror, suddenly erupted into a shrill, hysterical scream. She claimed she was entirely innocent of the entire conspiracy. She spun a frantic, desperate narrative declaring that Tyson had orchestrated the forgery and forced her into the scheme from the very beginning. She yelled that her husband was drowning in massive, hidden gambling debts to violent underground syndicates, referencing the wire transfers to her ex-boyfriend as proof of his supposed illicit activities. She screamed that these dangerous men had threatened to kill them both if Tyson did not come up with $20 million immediately. She cried out that Tyson had physically abused her, manipulating her paralyzing fear to make her contact the corrupt notary and the dark web forgers on his behalf. She painted herself as a terrified captive wife who was simply following the strict orders of a desperate, abusive man to save their lives. She begged the federal agent to check the offshore accounts, swearing that Tyson was the one pulling all the strings. Tyson pressed his back harder against the wood, shaking his head in absolute disbelief. He tried to stammer out a defense, his voice cracking, as he begged the federal agent not to listen to her vicious lies. He had sacrificed his relationship with his father to please this woman, turning a blind eye to my suffering, and at the very first sign of genuine danger, she was eagerly throwing him directly under a federal bus to save her own skin. It was a pathetic, chaotic display of ultimate betrayal. I did not raise my voice to defend my son, nor did I allow Jonathan or the federal agent to interrupt her psychotic performance. I simply sat at the head of the mahogany table and let her scream her fabricated victimhood into the silent room until she ran out of breath. Then I reached into the inside pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out the cheap plastic burner phone I had retrieved from the basement wall cavity. I placed it gently onto the polished table right next to my wine glass. I pressed the screen to access the saved audio files and tapped the play button, turning the small speaker volume to its absolute maximum. The sharp, crystal-clear audio filled the dining room, instantly cutting right through her manufactured sobs. It was the exact recording from the day she had marched down into the damp basement to slap me a second time. My daughter-in-law's own voice echoed off the silk wallpaper, dripping with pure, unadulterated venom. The recording captured every single damning word with flawless precision. The room listened in absolute silence as the digital version of Megan proudly boasted about independently selling my entire commercial building portfolio to Apex Holdings. The recording played her explicit promise to wire the $20 million exclusively into her own private offshore accounts, entirely cutting Tyson out of the conversation. And finally, the audio delivered her most horrifying threat, detailing her premeditated solo plan to lock me away in a state-run psychiatric ward for the rest of my life once the money cleared. The stark contrast between the hysterical, weeping victim currently pointing at her husband and the cold, calculating monster on the recording was absolute and undeniable. Her own voice had just driven the final, inescapable nail into her coffin. Special Agent Caldwell stepped forward, his heavy leather shoes thudding heavily against the imported rug. He looked at the burner phone resting on the table, and then back at Megan, his face completely devoid of any human sympathy. He casually remarked that the Federal Bureau of Investigation already possessed a massive mountain of digital evidence, including the cryptocurrency transfers and the dark web communication logs she thought were erased, but the clear audio confession of premeditated elder abuse and corporate theft was an excellent addition to the prosecutor's final file. He reached around to the back of his belt and unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The sharp, metallic clinking sound cut through the remaining tension in the room like a physical blade slicing through the air. Megan scrambled backward in blind panic, bumping hard against the edge of the dining table, her black couture gown catching and tearing on the wooden trim. She begged Caldwell to listen to her, wildly offering to return the $20 million to the company, completely forgetting that the funds had never actually left my offshore escrow account. Caldwell ignored her desperate, nonsensical pleas entirely. He grabbed her right wrist with a firm, unbreakable grip and swiftly secured the first heavy steel cuff. He spun her around effortlessly, forcing her arms behind her back, and locked the second cuff around her left wrist with a definitive, crushing click. As he securely tightened her restraints, Caldwell began reciting her Miranda rights with a practiced robotic cadence. He informed her of her constitutional right to remain silent, warning her that her pathetic attempts to frame her husband were already being formally logged as providing false statements to a federal officer. The physical reality of the cold steel biting deeply into her wrists finally shattered her arrogant mind completely. She realized there was no manipulation tactic left to play. No lie she could spin, and no money she could use to buy her way out of this trap. Megan lost all remaining composure. She began to thrash violently against the federal agent's strong grip, screaming my name with a guttural animalistic fury that distorted her beautiful features into a mask of pure hatred. She cursed the day I was born and swore she would destroy me, her manic shrieks echoing horribly through the massive hallways of the house she had tried to steal. Agent Caldwell did not flinch or offer a single word of response. He signaled silently to the security perimeter stationed outside the large bay windows. Within seconds, 2 more armed federal agents entered the formal dining room. They grabbed Megan by her arms and physically dragged her toward the front door. Her expensive designer heels dragged uselessly across the imported hardwood floors as she was forcefully pulled out of the mansion. Her terrifying high-pitched screams slowly faded into the cold Chicago night air as the heavy doors of an armored SUV slammed shut outside. Jonathan Hayes calmly gathered his thick leather briefcase from the table and nodded respectfully to me before grabbing the trembling notary by the collar. He escorted Gavin Brooks out of the house to face his own severe federal charges. Suddenly, the grand dining room was entirely empty save for me and my son. Tyson stood completely frozen against the heavy oak doors, his chest heaving rapidly as he stared blankly at the empty space where his dominant wife had just been arrested. The absolute silence of the massive house crashed down upon him like a physical weight. He slowly looked at the dining table, staring at the scattered counterfeit deeds, and finally forced his eyes upward to meet my cold gaze. His knees buckled under the crushing realization of his own profound guilt and supreme cowardice. He collapsed onto the imported rug, falling heavily to his hands and knees. He crawled slightly forward across the floor, tears streaming heavily down his face, and began desperately begging his father for a mercy he absolutely did not deserve. Tyson's tears heavily stained the expensive imported rug as he dragged his body across the floor. He reached up with trembling, desperate hands, his fingers violently grabbing the hem of my tailored charcoal suit jacket. He looked up at me, his face completely ruined by a toxic mixture of paralyzing fear and pathetic desperation. He sobbed uncontrollably, the sound hollow and grating in the massive, quiet dining room. He cried out that I was his father, his flesh, his only remaining family in this cold world. He swore on his late mother's grave that Megan had maliciously manipulated his mind, systematically twisting his judgment until he could no longer tell right from wrong. He begged me to remember the good times, frantically recalling the days when I taught him how to ride a bicycle in the long driveway of this very estate, the quiet weekends we used to spend building model cars in the heated garage. He practically choked on his own bitter tears as he pleaded for a second chance. He rapidly promised he would immediately check himself into a strict rehabilitation center for his hidden gambling addiction. He promised he would work in the lowest mailroom of my commercial real estate company, scrubbing the lobby floors on his hands and knees if he had to, just to prove his renewed loyalty. He squeezed the fine wool fabric of my coat tighter, his knuckles turning a stark, sickly white, babbling endlessly about the unbreakable bond of blood. He aggressively claimed that a father could never truly turn his back on his own child, regardless of the terrible mistakes made along the way. He was deploying every single emotional weapon he had left in his meager arsenal, desperately hoping to strike a hidden nerve of paternal weakness that he arrogantly assumed was still buried somewhere deep inside my chest. He wanted absolute forgiveness without putting in the excruciating work of earning it, demanding the unconditional love he had so easily and callously discarded when it was no longer financially convenient for him to defend me. I stood perfectly still, letting his desperate tears soak into the fabric of my coat for a long, agonizing moment. I looked down at the top of his head, searching my soul for a flicker of sympathy, but I felt absolutely nothing. The deep reservoir of paternal grace I had maintained for 35 years was completely, permanently dry. I slowly reached down and firmly grasped his wrists. I did not use anger, but I used a measured, undeniable physical force to pry his trembling fingers off my jacket one by one. I stepped backward, deliberately severing the physical connection between us. I looked directly into his tear-streaked face and spoke with a voice completely devoid of any human warmth. I told him that invoking the sacred name of his dead mother to save his own skin was the final, unforgivable insult. I coldly reminded him that blood is merely a biological fact, not a magical, impenetrable shield designed to protect a coward from the severe consequences of his own calculated treason. I explicitly listed his crimes, completely refusing to let him hide behind the pathetic excuse of his wife's aggressive manipulation. I pointed out that his precious blood connection did not compel him to intervene when his wife forcefully slapped my face in my own custom kitchen. His blood did not stop him from standing by while hired thugs threw my life's belongings into plastic garbage bags and locked me inside a freezing, damp basement like a stray dog. His blood did not stop him from demanding the keys to my vintage Mustang, effectively helping his wife steal my only joy. And his blood certainly did not stop him from standing silently in a cheap, filthy motel room while a corrupt public notary forged my signature to steal the financial empire I bled to build for his future. I explained that a man who stands by and passively watches his father be abused, humiliated, and discarded is not a son. He is simply a parasite waiting patiently for the host body to die. I told him that I did not view him as a tragic victim of Megan's towering ambition. I viewed him as a fully willing accomplice who was perfectly happy to let me rot away in a state-run psychiatric ward just as long as he eventually got to spend his half of the $20 million. The brutal surgical honesty of my verdict hit him like a physical blow to the stomach, completely silencing his pathetic sobbing. I turned away from his kneeling figure and walked over to the dark corner of the formal dining room. Resting quietly against the expensive silk wallpaper was a small beaten canvas suitcase. I had instructed one of my loyal security staff members to pack it with a few basic unbranded items from Tyson's massive designer wardrobe earlier that afternoon. I picked it up by the frayed handle and dropped it onto the hardwood floor right in front of his knees. The bag hit the ground with a dull, heavy thud. I reached into my trouser pocket and pulled out a single one-way Greyhound bus ticket heading out of the state to a small, economically depressed industrial town. I let the cheap paper ticket flutter down, landing softly on top of the canvas bag. I looked at the completely broken man kneeling on my floor and delivered his final inescapable sentence. I officially informed him that Jonathan Hayes had already drafted and filed the new ironclad estate documents. Tyson was completely and entirely disinherited. He was permanently removed from my last will and testament, completely cut off from all family generation trusts, and legally barred from ever claiming a single penny of my accumulated wealth. I told him he had exactly 2 minutes to pick up that cheap bag, walk out the front door of my house, and never return. I promised him with deadly, unwavering seriousness that if I ever saw his face on my personal property or anywhere near my corporate offices again, I would not hesitate to have my security team physically remove him and have the police arrest him for criminal trespassing. Tyson stared blankly at the cheap paper bus ticket resting on the canvas bag, the absolute crushing reality of his complete destruction finally settling heavily over his shoulders. There was no more arguing to be done. There was no more emotional manipulation left to deploy. The highly comfortable, incredibly wealthy life he had taken for granted since the exact day he was born was officially permanently over. He slowly pushed himself off the imported rug, his legs shaking violently under the sudden massive weight of his grim new reality. He did not attempt to look at me again. He reached down with a trembling hand and picked up the canvas handle of the suitcase. He turned around and walked slowly toward the heavy oak doors of the dining room. He pushed them open and stepped into the grand foyer, the hollow, lonely sound of his footsteps echoing loudly through the massive house he no longer had any legal or moral right to claim. He reached out, grabbed the brass handle of the massive front door, and stepped out into the biting, brutal cold of the Chicago night. The bitter, freezing wind immediately whipped against his expensive tailored tuxedo, serving as a stark physical reminder of the harsh, unforgiving world he now had to navigate entirely on his own without my financial protection. I walked slowly out of the formal dining room and stood silently in the grand entryway. I watched his dark silhouette shrink as he walked down the long, sweeping driveway toward the heavy iron gates. The federal armored SUVs were long gone. The distant wail of police sirens had completely faded into the city noise. There was only the freezing wind and the heavy, profound silence of the reclaimed estate. Tyson stepped through the gates, completely stripped of his unearned wealth, his toxic marriage, and his entire family. I reached out and pushed the heavy front door closed. The solid metallic click of the lock echoed loudly in the foyer, officially sealing the tomb of my past life and securing the perimeter of my new one. The heavy, solid oak door clicked shut, the metallic sound echoing through the grand foyer with absolute finality. I turned the brass deadbolt, effectively locking out the freezing Chicago wind and the toxic remnants of my former family. I stood alone in the massive entryway of my 20,000 square foot estate. For the first time in years, the house was entirely silent. It was not the heavy, oppressive silence of secrets and unspoken resentments that had suffocated these walls while Megan and Tyson lived here. It was a clean, crystalline silence. It was the sound of total victory. I took a deep breath, inhaling the quiet air, and began to walk slowly through the corridors I had designed and built with my own hands. I walked back into the formal dining room, the crystal chandelier still blazing brightly overhead. The counterfeit property deeds remained scattered across the mahogany table, worthless pieces of paper that had cost my daughter-in-law her entire freedom. I gathered them up, walked over to the grand stone fireplace, and tossed them onto the cold hearth. I did not light them on fire. I simply left them there as a pathetic monument to her supreme arrogance. I climbed the sweeping main staircase, my footsteps steady and strong. I walked directly into the master suite. The cloying, artificial scent of Megan's expensive floral perfume still hung faintly in the air. I walked straight to the large bay windows, unlatched the heavy glass panes, and threw them wide open. The biting winter breeze rushed into the room, sweeping away the stale warmth and instantly purifying the space. I stood by the open window, looking out over the dark, manicured lawns, feeling the profound, undisputed ownership of my territory settling deeply into my bones. The foundation was secure, the parasites had been surgically removed, I had reclaimed my kingdom. 6 months later, the brutal reality of the American justice system finished the job I had started. I sat quietly in the back row of the federal courthouse in downtown Chicago, wearing a flawless tailored suit, my posture perfectly straight. I watched as Megan was led into the sterile, brightly lit courtroom by 2 armed federal marshals. She was completely unrecognizable. The designer couture gowns, the flawless makeup, and the stolen diamond necklaces were entirely gone. She wore an oversized, faded orange canvas jumpsuit. Her hair was dull and pulled back into a severe knot. The supreme arrogance that had defined her entire existence had been completely crushed under the terrifying weight of federal prosecution. Her highly paid defense attorneys had desperately tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the audio confession I provided and the undeniable paper trail of counterfeit government documents left them absolutely nothing to work with. The federal judge, a stern woman with zero tolerance for white-collar predators who targeted the elderly, did not show a single ounce of mercy. She delivered a blistering lecture on greed and manipulation before handing down the official sentence. Megan was condemned to 10 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without any possibility of early parole. As the marshals grabbed her arms to lead her away, Megan turned her head and looked directly at me sitting in the gallery. She was crying her eyes, begging for a sliver of sympathy. I gave her nothing. I did not smile, and I did not frown. I simply stared back at her with a blank, cold indifference until the heavy courtroom doors swung shut behind her. Meanwhile, the universe was busy balancing the scales for my cowardly son. Stripped of his trust fund, his luxury cars, and his corporate safety net, Tyson was violently thrust into the unforgiving reality of the working class he had always secretly despised. My private investigator informed me that Tyson was currently living in a tiny roach-infested studio apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city. He was working the graveyard shift at a 24-hour gas station, wearing a cheap polyester uniform, mopping floors, and ringing up customers for minimum wage. He was struggling every single day just to buy basic groceries. The soft, privileged boy who had casually handed over my vintage Mustang to appease his psychotic wife was now learning the true agonizing value of a single dollar. With the legal battles officially concluded and the criminals safely locked inside their respective prisons, I needed to fulfill one final obligation. It was a crisp, clear spring morning when I drove my fully repaired vintage Mustang through the quiet, winding roads of the historic city cemetery. The manicured grass was bright green, and the early cherry blossoms were just beginning to bloom. I parked the car and walked slowly down the familiar stone path until I reached the polished black marble headstone resting beneath the shade of a massive oak tree. Evelyn. I stood before the grave of my late wife, feeling the gentle morning sun warming my shoulders. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a single flawless red rose, laying it gently across the engraved letters of her name. I stood there in the peaceful silence for a long time, letting the memories of our difficult but beautiful life together wash over me. I spoke to her out loud, my voice steady and completely devoid of sorrow. I told her about the storm that had tried to tear down the empire we had sacrificed our youth to build. I told her about the betrayal, the freezing basement, and the ruthless strategy I had executed to protect our life's work. I promised her that the wolves had been slaughtered and the gates were locked tight. I told Evelyn that she could finally rest in absolute peace because the foundation of our legacy was completely secure. A profound, healing calm washed through my entire body. The lingering anger and the bitter sting of my son's betrayal finally evaporated into the spring air. I touched the cold marble one last time, whispered a quiet goodbye, and walked back to my car, ready to face the future. However, as I drove back through the heavy iron gates of my sprawling estate later that afternoon, a new, unexpected realization began to take root in my mind. I walked through the grand foyer, my footsteps echoing loudly against the imported hardwood floors. I wandered through the massive formal dining room, the enormous custom kitchen, and the towering library filled with thousands of books. The house was magnificent, a true architectural masterpiece, but it was also entirely empty. I was a 70-year-old man, living completely alone in a fortress designed for a massive family. I sat down in my leather armchair, staring at the sheer volume of wealth and space surrounding me. Hoarding this immense power and living in silent isolation felt like a tragic waste of the absolute control I had just fought so viciously to reclaim. I had used my sharp mind, my untraceable offshore accounts, and my decades of ruthless business experience to crush the predators who tried to exploit me. But I knew with absolute certainty that there were thousands of other elderly people in this city facing the exact same terrifying abuse from greedy relatives. They were being manipulated, robbed, and locked away in cheap nursing homes, and they did not have a Vanguard Horizon shell company or a brilliant attorney like Jonathan Hayes to save them. True power is not defined by how high you build your own walls. True power is defined by how many people you can protect within your gates. I looked around the massive, empty rooms of the first floor, my mind automatically shifting back into the familiar, focused mindset of a master commercial developer. I did not need a dining room that could seat 30 people, and I did not need 5 empty guest bedrooms gathering dust. I reached for the notepad resting on my desk and picked up a heavy fountain pen. I began to sketch a new set of blueprints. The silent adjustment of my own life was officially complete, but a much larger adjustment was just about to begin. The heavy oak doors of the formal dining room were removed entirely. I brought in a specialized team of commercial contractors, the exact same men I had employed for decades in the downtown high-rises, and I instructed them to completely tear down the dividing walls of the first floor. The grand echoing spaces that Megan had desperately tried to fill with arrogant socialites and stolen wine were systematically gutted and rebuilt with a profound new purpose. Within 3 short months, the entire ground level of my 20,000 square foot estate was transformed into the primary headquarters for the Evelyn and Dominic Vanguard Foundation. We were no longer a quiet residential property. We were a fully funded, high-powered legal aid clinic dedicated entirely to protecting vulnerable elderly citizens from the exact kind of devastating financial abuse I had personally endured. I replaced the massive crystal chandeliers with bright, efficient workspace lighting. The room where Megan had been arrested in her couture gown was now filled with sleek desks, ringing telephones, and a dedicated team of aggressive junior attorneys paid directly from my offshore accounts. I sat in my newly constructed glass office watching my legal team systematically dismantle predatory guardianship filings, freeze fraudulent property transfers, and aggressively prosecute corrupt family members who thought they could casually steal from the generation that raised them. The house was no longer a silent, empty tomb waiting for an old man to die. It was vibrating with an intense, righteous energy. We were taking desperate calls from terrified grandparents across the state, people who were being locked in basements, forced into cheap nursing homes, or robbed blind by their own greedy children. We stepped into their nightmares with the full, terrifying weight of a multi-million-dollar corporate legal team, and we absolutely crushed the predators who preyed upon them. Amidst the chaotic, beautiful hum of our daily operations, one specific individual stood out. Her name was Naomi. She was a 24-year-old, fiercely intelligent African-American law student who had applied for an internship during our very first week of operation. She did not come from money. She grew up in the same tough South Side neighborhoods where I had laid my very first bricks, and she possessed a relentless burning drive that I immediately recognized. It was the exact same raw, uncompromising hunger I had felt when I first started building my real estate empire 50 years ago. Naomi did not just file paperwork or answer phones. She dove into the most complex, convoluted financial fraud cases with a terrifying surgical precision. I watched her tear apart a corrupt bank manager during a deposition, her voice perfectly calm, but her logic completely lethal. Over the next year, Naomi moved beyond the role of a simple employee. She became my direct protege, absorbing every single lesson I taught her about commercial real estate corporate strategy and the absolute necessity of emotional control in a courtroom. We spent late evenings reviewing case files over black coffee, analyzing legal loopholes, and sharing quiet stories about our respective struggles. She possessed the fierce loyalty and the razor-sharp integrity that my own biological son had completely lacked. I did not just teach her the law. I taught her how to build an impenetrable fortress around herself and the vulnerable clients she represented. I formally and legally adopted her into my family trust, effectively naming her as the sole heir and future executor of the Vanguard Foundation. I had lost a cowardly son to greed and manipulation. But in the ashes of that profound betrayal, I found a brilliant, powerful daughter. Naomi was the family I deliberately chose, bound not by the chaotic accident of genetics, but by a shared, unbreakable commitment to justice and the fundamental protection of our legacy. I sat comfortably behind my massive custom-built mahogany desk, my fingers resting lightly against the smooth leather surface. The large bay windows of my office offered a completely unobstructed panoramic view of the sprawling Chicago skyline. I looked out at the towering glass and steel skyscrapers, identifying the specific commercial buildings I had poured my blood and sweat into constructing decades ago. They stood tall and unyielding against the bitter winds blowing off the lake. I realized that my life had always been defined by the structures I built, but the most important fortress I ever constructed was not made of concrete or iron. It was made of absolute, terrifying silence. When my daughter-in-law struck my face and my son looked away, the world expected an old man to scream, to break down, to fight back with useless, messy emotion. But true power does not react. True power absorbs the blow, calculates the precise trajectory of the enemy, and waits for the exact perfect moment to strike a fatal, undeniable blow. I had allowed Megan to believe she was the smartest person in the room. I let her lock me in the basement, steal my cars, and forge my name because I knew that every single arrogant step she took was leading her directly into a federal cage I had meticulously designed. Strategic patience is the ultimate weapon of the truly powerful. You do not need to raise your voice to command a room, and you do not need to throw a punch to utterly destroy a predator. You simply need to understand the structural weaknesses of the people trying to break you, and then quietly remove the pillars supporting their delusions. My name is Dominic. I am 70 years old, and I am standing at the absolute peak of my power. Society tells us that the elderly are supposed to quietly fade into the background, to hand over the reins, and to simply accept whatever pathetic scraps of respect our children decide to throw at us. We are expected to wither away in dark basements or sterile nursing homes while the younger generation carelessly squanders the wealth we sacrificed our entire lives to build. I completely refuse to accept that narrative. An ending is only a tragedy if you lack the courage to pick up the pen and write a new, brutally honest chapter for yourself. I burned my old life to the ground, eradicated the toxic parasites who wore the masks of family, and from those ashes I forged an entirely new kingdom dedicated to protecting the weak and punishing the greedy. The brutal, silent adjustment of my reality is now permanently complete. I am no longer a victim, a hostage, or a discarded father. I am the architect of my own destiny, and I will protect my legacy until my dying breath. If you are watching this, let my story serve as a permanent, undeniable warning. Never mistake a quiet man for a weak man. Never assume that the elderly have forgotten how to fight. And never, under any circumstances, bite the hand that built the very house you sleep in. Thank you for listening to my story. Stay strong, protect your legacy, and never let anyone diminish your true worth. The most profound lesson I learned is that you must never set yourself on fire to keep ungrateful people warm. For decades, I equated fatherhood with endless financial sacrifice, blinding myself to the monsters I was feeding. True power does not announce itself with screams or public cruelty. True power is patient, calculating, and completely silent. It is the courage to meticulously dismantle the very empire you built, rather than let it fall into the hands of parasites. If you are currently suffering in silence, stand up today. Subscribe to our channel and share your own story in the comments.